The bells of Notre Dame tolled through the winter air of Paris, their bronze voices echoing off stone walls and thatched roofs as they announced the death of Charles IV of France. In his chamber at Vincennes, the last of the direct Capetian line drew his final breath, leaving behind a kingdom but no son to inherit it. For over 3 centuries, since the first Hugh Capet had seized power from the last Carolingian king, the crown had passed from father to son in an unbroken chain of blood and ambition. Now that chain was shattered, and with it, the peace of Europe. The dying king's wife, Jeanne d'Evreux, was heavy with child, carrying perhaps the heir that could preserve the dynasty and prevent the crisis that now loomed over the realm. But kingdoms cannot wait for birth pangs and royal succession. In castle halls from Normandy to Champagne, from Brittany to Burgundy, noble houses began to sharpen their claims and count their supporters. The great wheel of medieval politics had begun to turn, creaking with the weight of centuries. And when it finally stopped, 2 kingdoms would be locked in a struggle that would consume the known world. In the immediate aftermath of Charles's death, the crown passed to his cousin, Philip of Valois, Count of Anjou and Maine. Philip was a man of impressive bearing, tall, fair-haired, with the kind of martial presence that commanded respect in castle courtyards and tournament grounds across France. His voice carried authority, his sword arm had proven itself in a dozen campaigns, and his political instincts were sharp enough to navigate the treacherous waters of French court intrigue. He had fought alongside the late king in bloody campaigns against the English in Gascony, where he had learned to respect the tactical innovations of English longbowmen, while developing his own strategies for countering them. When the assembly of French barons gathered in the great hall of the Louvre to choose their new king, Philip's claim seemed both logical and inevitable. He was Charles's closest male relative through the legitimate line, nephew to the legendary Philip IV the Fair, and possessed the dual virtues of royal blood and proven competence in both warfare and statecraft. But across the English Channel, another claimant watched these proceedings with growing indignation and carefully concealed ambition. Edward III of England was only 15 when Charles IV died, but behind his youth lay a claim that would reshape the map of Europe and redefine the nature of kingship itself. Through his mother, Isabella, the she-wolf of France, Edward was the grandson of Philip IV the Fair, closer in blood to the dead king than Philip of Valois himself. Isabella had been Charles IV's sister, making her son a direct descendant where Philip of Valois was merely a cousin reaching through the male line to grasp legitimacy. The question that would launch 1,000 battles and consume 5 generations was deceptively simple. Could a kingdom pass through the female line? In the gilded chambers of the French court, lawyers and nobles quickly produced ancient precedents suggesting it could not. They invoked what would later be called the Salic law, though this legal principle was more political convenience than established tradition, more necessity than ancient wisdom. Women, they argued with growing certainty, could neither inherit the crown nor pass on their claims to their male heirs. The realm must descend through unbroken male succession, even if that meant reaching further into the family tree to find a suitable candidate. Better a distant cousin through the male line than a closer heir through female blood. Edward III, advised by his formidable mother and his growing circle of ambitious nobles, saw through this legal fiction immediately. Isabella herself had been one of the most powerful political figures of her generation, deposing her own husband Edward II and ruling England as regent during her son's minority. If women could not inherit or transmit claims, then how had the English crown itself passed through female lines in the past? How had noble houses throughout Europe maintained their bloodlines and their power? The French were not preserving ancient law. They were manufacturing new ones to suit their immediate political needs, crafting legal theories as weapons of state. But Edward was young, and England had pressing concerns closer to home that demanded immediate attention. The Scottish question remained unresolved, with Robert the Bruce's successors still challenging English overlordship in the north. English barons grumbled about taxation and questioned the wisdom of continental adventures when domestic security remained uncertain. For now, Edward grudgingly accepted Philip VI's coronation, even performing the ritual homage for his French territories of Gascony and Ponthieu, in a ceremony that would prove to be one of the most fateful diplomatic moments in European history. This act of homage at Amiens Cathedral contained within it all the seeds of future conflict, like a poison oak planted in fertile soil. When Edward knelt before Philip, placing his hands between those of the French king and swearing fealty in the ancient Norman words, he was acknowledging Philip as his feudal superior for his continental possessions. The words echoed in the vast stone space. "I become your man for the lands I hold of you beyond the sea, according to the form of peace made between our ancestors." Yet even as he spoke these words of submission, Edward ruled England as a sovereign king, bowing to no earthly lord save God himself. The contradiction was stark and ultimately unstable. Like a building constructed on shifting foundations, the feudal relationships that governed medieval Europe had grown increasingly complex and contradictory by the 14th century. The Duke of Gascony owed allegiance to the King of France, but the Duke of Gascony and the King of England happened to be the same person. This arrangement had been tolerable when royal power was weak and personal relationships could smooth over legal inconsistencies. French kings had accepted this situation for generations because it brought the powerful English crown into their feudal orbit, making England's kings technically their subjects for vast territories in southwestern France. But as royal power grew stronger in both kingdoms, as bureaucracies replaced personal rule and institutional loyalty began to supersede feudal bonds, such ambiguous relationships became powder kegs waiting for a spark. That spark came from an unexpected direction: the prosperous cloth towns of Flanders, where the rhythmic clack of looms created both wealth and political complexity. The Count of Flanders was, like Edward III, both a French vassal and the ruler of territories with powerful English connections. In the great halls of Bruges and Ghent, Flemish weavers worked English wool into the finest cloth in Europe, their skilled fingers transforming raw fleece into luxury goods that commanded premium prices from the merchant houses of Venice to the trading posts of Bergen. This symbiotic relationship had enriched both kingdoms for generations, creating a web of economic interdependence that made political conflict seem almost impossible. But when Philip VI attempted to assert greater control over Flanders, supporting the Count against rebellious towns that sought greater autonomy, he struck directly at English economic interests. The wool trade was England's lifeline to continental prosperity, the golden thread that connected English pastures to European markets. English sheep produced the finest fleeces in the known world, and their wool supported not just the great lords who owned vast flocks, but also the countless small farmers, shearers, packers, and transporters who made the trade possible. The profits from this commerce financed the English crown, supported the landed gentry who controlled the great sheep runs of the Cotswolds and Yorkshire, and employed thousands of workers in both kingdoms. The intricacies of medieval banking added another layer of complexity to this economic web. Italian banking houses, the Bardi, the Peruzzi, the Acciaiuoli, had become the financiers of European royalty, lending vast sums against future wool revenues and tax collections. These bankers had learned to play both sides of every conflict, lending to English kings against their wool exports, while simultaneously financing French military campaigns. Their ledger books, carefully maintained in the counting houses of Florence and Siena, recorded debts and obligations that could make or break kingdoms. When Edward III contemplated war with France, he knew he would need their support, but he also knew they would hedge their bets by continuing to finance his enemies. When French interference threatened to disrupt the delicate balance of Flemish politics, Edward III faced a choice that would define his reign and reshape European history. He could accept diminished English influence in the region that generated much of his kingdom's wealth, retreating into the insularity that had characterized previous English kings, or he could find a way to push back against French expansion, risking everything on a grand gamble that might win him a kingdom or cost him his own. Initially, Edward chose economic warfare, demonstrating the same tactical thinking that would later make him famous on battlefields. He banned the export of English wool to Flanders, hoping to pressure the Flemish towns to reject French control and seek English protection instead. The strategy was brilliant in theory. Cut off the raw material that powered Flemish prosperity, and the weavers would have no choice but to support whoever could restore their supply lines. But like many brilliant strategies, it proved devastating in practice. English sheep farmers found themselves unable to sell their fleeces, watching their livelihood rot in barns while royal revenues plummeted and unemployment spread through the countryside like plague. The Flemish, meanwhile, proved more resourceful than anticipated. They turned to alternative suppliers in Spain and North Africa, accepted lower quality wool from Scotland and Ireland, and weathered the disruption better than the English had hoped. The wool embargo's failure convinced Edward that half measures would never secure England's position in this changing world. If he wanted to protect English interests in Flanders, he would need to challenge French power directly. And if he was going to challenge French power, why not pursue his rightful claim to the French throne itself? The legal argument that had seemed merely academic suddenly took on urgent, practical significance. Edward was not merely the English king seeking to protect his continental territories. He was the rightful king of France, fighting to reclaim his stolen inheritance from a usurper who had manipulated French law to steal what was rightfully his. As Edward contemplated this momentous decision, he found unexpected support from powerful allies across Europe. The Holy Roman Emperor Louis IV, locked in his own bitter struggle with the French-backed Pope at Avignon, offered to recognize Edward's claim in exchange for English military assistance against the Papal States. More importantly, the Flemish towns themselves began to show genuine interest in English protection. If Edward could present himself as the legitimate King of France, then supporting him against Philip VI would not be rebellion, but righteous restoration of proper authority. The transformation of Edward III from reluctant vassal to claimant king did not happen overnight, but unfolded like a carefully orchestrated drama across many months. Throughout this period, diplomatic missions travelled between London and Paris with increasing urgency, seeking some accommodation that might preserve peace and prevent the catastrophe that both kingdoms could see approaching. Philip VI, for his part, seemed genuinely puzzled by the escalating crisis. He had been accepted as king by the French nobility, crowned by the church in the sacred ceremony at Reims, and recognized by foreign powers from the Holy Roman Empire to the papal court. Edward's claim struck him as a legal technicality, being blown out of proportion by English greed and wounded pride. But Philip failed to understand the broader forces at work in this new century. The Europe of the late 1300s was not the Europe of the crusading era, or even the time of his grandfather, Philip the Fair. Royal governments had grown stronger, more centralized, and more capable of projecting power across great distances. Professional bureaucracies were replacing personal household administration. Standing armies were beginning to supplement feudal levies. The personal relationships that had once kept feudal conflicts localized and limited were giving way to institutional loyalty and something approaching national identity. The northern dimension of this growing conflict added yet another layer of complexity and danger. The old alliance between France and Scotland, forged in mutual hatred of English expansion, meant that any war between England and France would inevitably become a war on two fronts. Scottish raids across the border were a constant threat to English security, and French gold regularly found its way into Scottish coffers to finance these incursions. Edward had already demonstrated his military capabilities against the Scots at Halidon Hill, where English longbowmen had devastated a Scottish army in a battle that served as both tactical masterpiece and strategic preview. The Battle of Halidon Hill had been a revelation for those who understood its implications. Scottish knights, charging uphill against prepared English positions, had been cut down by clouds of arrows long before they could bring their lances to bear. The lesson was unmistakable. Disciplined archers, properly positioned and supported, could defeat even the finest heavy cavalry when conditions favored the defense. Edward and his military advisors studied this victory carefully, drawing lessons that would soon be applied on a much larger scale against the flower of French chivalry. The final diplomatic rupture came when Philip VI declared Edward's French fiefs forfeit for his failure to appear at the French court to answer charges of harboring Philip's enemies. This declaration was both the legal pretext for war and its practical beginning. Edward could no longer maintain his impossible position as both English king and French vassal. The contradiction that had been tolerable in peacetime became impossible in crisis, like trying to serve two masters who now demanded exclusive loyalty. On a grey November day, Edward III formally claimed the title of King of France and England, quartering the French fleur-de-lis with the English leopards on his coat of arms in a heraldic declaration of intent. The gesture was both symbolic and intensely practical, signalling to potential allies across Europe that this was not merely another feudal squabble over rights and revenues, but a war of royal succession with implications for every kingdom in Christendom. Edward was not rebelling against his feudal superior. He was reclaiming his rightful throne from a usurper who had twisted law and custom to steal what belonged to him by right of blood. The first major test of these grand claims came not on land, but on the waves of the English Channel, where control of the seas would determine whether Edward could actually transport his armies to the continent. The Battle of Sluys transformed a Flemish harbour into a slaughter ground where English naval tactics proved as revolutionary as their land-based innovations would later become. French ships, heavy with armoured knights and traditional siege equipment, found themselves outmaneuvered by English vessels designed for speed and missile warfare. English archers, fighting from ship to ship as if conducting a land battle on wooden platforms, decimated French crews with the same devastating volleys that had broken Scottish cavalry at Halidon Hill. When the smoke cleared over Sluys harbour, the French fleet lay destroyed, and English control of the Channel was established for generations to come. This victory was more than tactical. It was transformational, proving that English military innovations could succeed against the greatest powers in Europe. The path to France now lay open, and Edward's armies could cross the narrow seas whenever strategy dictated. As the immediate crisis of the war's opening phase settled into the longer rhythms of sustained conflict, Both kingdoms began to understand that they had unleashed forces that would reshape medieval Europe. The feudal world of personal loyalty and fragmented authority was about to collide with the emerging forces of centralized monarchy and national identity. From that collision would emerge new forms of government, new military technologies, new economic relationships, and new ways of understanding what it meant to be English or French. The war that began as a dispute over feudal succession would end as something entirely different. A struggle between emerging nation-states that had learned to mobilize their entire populations for sustained conflict. But that transformation lay decades in the future. For now, two kings had committed their kingdoms to a test of strength that would consume generations and transform the very nature of European civilization. The war that had begun with legal arguments and diplomatic protests now transformed into something far more visceral and devastating. Edward III's victory at Sluys had opened the gates to France, but what followed would reshape not just the political map of Europe, but the very soul of medieval warfare itself. The chivalric ideals that had governed combat for centuries, the notion of honorable single combat, the protection of non-combatants, the ransoming rather than slaughter of noble prisoners, would be tested against new realities of systematic destruction and calculated brutality. The English strategy that emerged in these opening years was as brilliant as it was ruthless. Rather than attempting to conquer and hold French territory in the traditional manner, Edward and his commanders developed the chevauchée, a form of warfare that was part raid, part psychological operation, and part economic assault. These destructive marches across the French countryside aimed not at capturing castles or winning pitched battles, but at demonstrating Philip VI's inability to protect his own people while systematically destroying the economic foundation of French royal power. The first great chevauchée began when Edward landed at La Hogue in Normandy, with an army that represented everything innovative about English military thinking. Gone were the unwieldy feudal levies of previous centuries, replaced by a professional force built around the deadly combination of longbowmen and dismounted men-at-arms. These were not knights seeking individual glory through mounted charges, but disciplined soldiers trained to fight as coordinated units. The longbowmen, drawn primarily from the yeoman farmers of England and Wales, could loose 12 arrows per minute, with accuracy deadly at ranges that made traditional cavalry charges suicidal. Supporting them were men-at-arms who had learned to fight on foot, using their superior armor and weapons in defensive formations that could withstand any assault, while the archers did their lethal work. As this army began its march across Normandy, the true horror of the chevauchée became apparent. This was not warfare as medieval minds understood it, but something approaching total war against an entire population. English soldiers burned every village they encountered, slaughtered livestock, destroyed mills and granaries, and left behind a wasteland where nothing could support human life. The smoke from burning towns could be seen for miles, creating a trail of devastation that marked the army's passage like a scar across the landscape. The psychological impact of this destruction was perhaps even more devastating than the physical damage. For generations, French peasants had looked to their lords for protection, accepting feudal obligations in exchange for security. Now they watched helplessly as English armies roamed at will through the heart of France, while their king and his nobles seemed powerless to intervene. The social contract that held medieval society together was being shattered village by village, castle by castle, as the reality of French weakness became undeniable. Philip VI, meanwhile, found himself trapped by the very chivalric traditions that were supposed to guarantee his superiority. French military doctrine emphasized the decisive battle, the glorious charge of heavy cavalry that would sweep enemies from the field and restore proper order to the world. But the English refused to cooperate with these expectations. They moved quickly, struck without warning, and melted away before French forces could concentrate against them. When Philip finally assembled a great army to bring the invaders to battle, Edward had already moved beyond reach, leaving behind only smoke and ash to mark his passage. The frustration of the French court was palpable, as reports arrived daily of new destructions, new humiliations, new demonstrations of English military superiority. French knights, trained from childhood to seek glory through individual combat, found themselves chasing shadows while their homeland burned around them. The economic damage was staggering. Entire regions that had contributed to royal revenues for centuries were reduced to wastelands that would take decades to recover. But perhaps more damaging still was the blow to French prestige, the growing sense that Philip VI was not the warrior king France needed in this crisis. The reckoning finally came near the small town of Crécy, where geography and politics combined to force the climactic battle that both sides had been anticipating. Edward's army, laden with plunder from their march across Normandy, found themselves cornered by a French force that outnumbered them perhaps 3-1. For the French, this seemed like divine justice. The English raiders would finally face the full might of French chivalry in open combat. For Edward, it was the ultimate test of everything he had learned about warfare from his campaigns in Scotland and his study of military innovation. The Battle of Crécy unfolded like a morality play about the death of one world and the birth of another. On one side stood the flower of French nobility, knights whose bloodlines stretched back to Charlemagne, whose armor cost more than entire villages, whose horses were bred specifically for the thunderous charge that had dominated European battlefields for centuries. These men represented everything magnificent and terrible about medieval chivalry. Their courage was absolute, their skill in combat legendary, their sense of honor unshakable. They rode to battle as their ancestors had ridden against the Saracens, confident that God would favor the righteous and that individual prowess would triumph over mere numbers. Facing them across the muddy field were Edward's archers, many of them farmers and craftsmen who had learned their deadly skills hunting deer in English forests or defending their villages against Scottish raiders. They carried weapons made from yew trees that might have grown for decades before being shaped into instruments of war. Their arrows were tipped with bodkin points designed specifically to penetrate armor, and their tactics had been refined through years of practical warfare against enemies who refused to follow the traditional rules of combat. When the French knights finally charged, their war cries echoing across the battlefield like thunder, they rode into what can only be described as a mechanical slaughter. The English longbowmen, positioned behind stakes and earthworks that channeled the attack into killing zones, began loosing their arrows in coordinated volleys that darkened the sky. The sound was unlike anything heard before in medieval warfare. Not the clash of steel on steel that characterized knightly combat, but the whistling death of thousands of arrows finding their targets with scientific precision. The finest horses in France, bred for generations to carry armored knights into battle, collapsed screaming as arrow after arrow found gaps in their armor. Knights who had trained their entire lives for this moment found themselves trapped beneath dying mounts. Their expensive armor turned into metal coffins as English arrows punched through steel as if it were cloth. Those who managed to reach the English lines discovered that their traditional mounted advantage meant nothing against disciplined infantry fighting from prepared positions. Wave after wave of French nobility charged into this mechanical hell, driven by codes of honor that demanded they die rather than retreat in the face of mere commoners. The Count of Alençon led his men forward, shouting battle cries that had inspired French knights for generations, only to disappear beneath a cloud of arrows that left his banner trampled in the mud. The King of Bohemia, blind and ancient but determined to die with sword in hand, had his horse's reins tied to those of his companions so he could charge toward the sound of battle. He was found the next morning, surrounded by the bodies of his loyal knights, all pierced through with English arrows. By the time darkness finally ended the slaughter, the field at Crécy was carpeted with the bodies of French nobility. More than 1,500 knights lay dead, along with countless men-at-arms and common soldiers. The English losses were reported as fewer than 50 men, a ratio so devastating that many refused to believe it. But the evidence lay scattered across the battlefield, the cream of French chivalry destroyed by English yeomen, whose names would never be recorded in chronicles of noble deeds. The aftermath of Crécy sent shockwaves through every court in Europe. The invincibility of heavy cavalry, the foundation of medieval military thinking for centuries, had been shattered by commoners with simple weapons and superior tactics. Kings and princes who had built their entire military systems around armored knights suddenly faced the terrifying possibility that their expensive armies might be obsolete, their military traditions mere anachronisms in an age of new warfare. Edward III, meanwhile, demonstrated that his innovations extended beyond mere battlefield tactics. Rather than pursuing the broken French army, he turned toward the strategic prize of Calais, the great port that controlled access to the English Channel. But the siege of Calais would prove that English military thinking had evolved beyond the simple destruction of the chevauchée to encompass sophisticated strategic planning worthy of classical antiquity. The siege itself became a masterpiece of medieval military engineering and political calculation. Edward surrounded the city with fortifications so elaborate that they constituted virtually a second city, complete with markets, workshops, and permanent buildings for his army. This was not the hasty blockade typical of medieval sieges, but a methodical strangulation designed to last as long as necessary. English ships controlled the harbour, while English engineers diverted rivers to prevent relief from the landward side. The citizens of Calais found themselves trapped in what amounted to a slowly tightening noose. For 11 months, the siege continued, with a precision that spoke to English organisational capabilities far beyond what anyone had imagined possible. Edward's army, rather than dispersing to winter quarters, as medieval armies traditionally did, maintained their positions through careful planning and regular supply from England. The English king had essentially established a permanent English settlement on French soil, demonstrating a level of logistical sophistication that transformed siege warfare from a test of endurance into a science of systematic pressure. The citizens of Calais, meanwhile, endured horrors that would haunt French memory for generations. As food supplies dwindled, the city became a laboratory of human suffering. Families consumed their pets, then boiled leather, then finally turned to substances that would not bear description in polite company. The dead were too numerous to bury properly, and disease began to consume those whom starvation had not already claimed. Yet still the city held, sustained by hope that Philip VI would somehow break through English lines and restore them to life. When Philip finally arrived with a relief army, the confrontation that followed demonstrated how completely the balance of military power had shifted. The French king, surveying English fortifications that turned his army's approach into a deadly funnel, recognized that any assault would result in another Crécy. Rather than sacrifice his remaining nobility in a hopeless attack, he withdrew, abandoning Calais to its fate. The psychological impact of this abandonment was perhaps even more devastating than the military defeat at Crécy. A French king had admitted that he could not protect his own subjects, that English military superiority was now so complete that resistance was futile. The surrender of Calais was orchestrated with theatrical precision that emphasized both English magnanimity and French humiliation. 6 of the city's leading citizens, dressed in sackcloth with ropes around their necks, presented themselves to Edward as sacrificial offerings for their city's resistance. The king's initial intention was reportedly to execute them as an example to other French cities, but the intervention of his Queen Philippa, pleading for mercy on her knees, created a scene of royal clemency that would be celebrated in English chronicles for centuries. But mercy, in this context, was itself a form of power. By sparing the 6 burghers, Edward demonstrated that he was not merely a conqueror, but a legitimate sovereign capable of the royal virtue of clemency. The entire population of Calais was expelled and replaced with English settlers, transforming the city into an English colony on French soil. This was not temporary occupation, but permanent annexation, the creation of what would become known as the English Pale, a foothold in France that would endure for more than 2 centuries. Just as Edward's military machine seemed unstoppable, nature intervened with a catastrophe that dwarfed even the destruction of the chevauchée. The Black Death arrived in Europe like the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse made manifest, a plague so devastating that it stopped armies in their tracks and reduced the grandest human ambitions to dust. The disease, carried by rats on merchant ships from the east, spread through trade routes that connected every corner of the known world. The plague's impact on medieval society was apocalyptic in ways that modern minds struggle to comprehend. Entire villages were wiped out, leaving behind only empty houses and overgrown fields. Great cities lost half their populations in a matter of months. The social structures that had taken centuries to develop collapsed as suddenly as buildings in an earthquake. Peasants abandoned their fields, priests fled their parishes, and nobles barricaded themselves in their castles while death stalked the countryside like a physical presence. For the armies of England and France, the plague was both destroyer and preserver. Campaigns that had seemed certain to decide the war's outcome were abandoned, as soldiers sickened and died faster than enemies could kill them. The great English war machine that had conquered Normandy and captured Calais found itself fighting an enemy that arrows could not touch and armor could not deflect. French hopes for revenge were equally dashed as their armies melted away in the face of invisible death. Yet the plague's impact was not equally distributed between the 2 kingdoms. England, protected by the Channel and less densely populated than France, suffered terribly but retained more of its organizational capacity. France, already devastated by years of English raids and now decimated by disease, saw its royal administration collapse in many regions. The careful financial and military systems that Philip VI had been building to counter English advantages were swept away by mortality rates that sometimes reached 50% in urban areas. When the plague finally began to recede, it left behind a transformed world where traditional relationships between lords and peasants had been shattered by massive depopulation. Surviving peasants, now scarce and therefore valuable, began demanding higher wages and better conditions. The rigid social hierarchies that had seemed divinely ordained for centuries suddenly became negotiable as economic necessity trumped ancient custom. In England, this transformation would eventually contribute to the peasants' revolt. In France, it would manifest as the Jacquerie, a peasant uprising that revealed the depth of social dissolution beneath the surface of royal authority. The war resumed in this transformed landscape, with a new generation of leaders and new military innovations that built upon the lessons learned before the plague. Edward the Black Prince, heir to the English throne and already a veteran of Crécy despite his youth, led a new chevauchée through southern France that demonstrated how English tactics had evolved during the plague years. This was not merely destructive raiding, but systematic political warfare designed to detach French territories from their allegiance to the Valois crown. The campaign that culminated at Poitiers represented the perfection of English military art in this phase of the war. The Black Prince, commanding an army smaller than what his father had led at Crécy, found himself facing a French force led by King John II, Philip II's son and successor. But the French had learned from Crécy's bitter lessons. John's army fought largely on foot, neutralizing English advantages against cavalry, and their tactics showed sophisticated understanding of how to counter longbow formations. The Battle of Poitiers should have been France's revenge for Crécy, the moment when superior numbers and improved tactics restored the natural order of European warfare. Instead, it became an even more devastating demonstration of English military superiority, not through technological advantage, but through tactical brilliance that outmaneuvered French adaptations. The Black Prince, recognizing that his traditional defensive tactics might not suffice against a more sophisticated enemy, opted for a battle plan of breathtaking audacity. Rather than await the French assault in prepared positions, the English army executed a complex maneuver that divided their forces while maintaining coordination between separated units. As French forces committed to what they believed was the main English position, a flanking force led by the Captal de Buch struck their exposed flank with mounted men-at-arms in a charge that caught the French completely unprepared. The irony was profound. English knights, fighting in the French manner with mounted shock tactics, shattered a French army that had adopted English defensive methods. The capture of King John II at Poitiers sent shockwaves through France that exceeded even the trauma of Crécy. A French king had not been taken prisoner in battle since the disaster of Bouvines more than a century earlier, and that defeat had been quickly reversed. This was different. A systematic defeat that demonstrated English military superiority so complete that it called into question the fundamental legitimacy of Valois rule. With their king in English captivity, France faced a crisis that threatened the kingdom's very survival. The aftermath of Poitiers revealed the full extent of French social and political fragmentation. With royal authority collapsed, the kingdom descended into a chaos that made English raids seem minor by comparison. The Jacquerie erupted as French peasants, driven beyond endurance by years of war and exploitation, turned on their noble oppressors with savage fury. Jacques Bonhomme, the mythical figure who gave his name to the uprising, became the symbol of peasant rage unleashed against centuries of feudal exploitation. The violence of the Jacquerie was shocking even by medieval standards. French peasants, armed with agricultural tools transformed into weapons of war, slaughtered nobles and burned their castles with methodical thoroughness. Noble families that had ruled their regions for centuries were exterminated in orgies of violence that represented the complete breakdown of feudal society. The uprising was eventually suppressed with equal brutality, but the damage to French social cohesion was irreparable. Into this chaos came the Treaty of Bretigny, an agreement that represented the high watermark of English success in the war's first phase. The terms were so favourable to England that they amounted to the partial dismemberment of France. Edward III, in exchange for renouncing his claim to the French throne, received sovereignty over vast territories in southwestern France, including Gascony, Poitou, and the newly conquered Calais. The ransom demanded for King John's release was set at 3 million gold crowns, a sum so enormous that it would cripple French finances for generations. More significantly, the treaty established Edward not as a French vassal for these territories, but as their sovereign lord, ending the feudal relationship that had been the original source of conflict. The Duke of Gascony would no longer owe homage to the King of France because there would be no Duke of Gascony, only the King of England ruling French territories by right of conquest. This represented a fundamental transformation in the nature of European political relationships, replacing feudal obligations with something approaching modern international boundaries. Yet even at the moment of their greatest triumph, English leaders began to sense that their victories had unleashed forces beyond their control. The chivalric world that had made their military innovations so effective was dying, killed by the very success of those innovations. The French nobility that had provided such magnificent targets at Crécy and Poitiers was learning to fight differently, adapting to new realities with the same determination that had once driven them to glorious death. More ominously, the social upheavals triggered by military defeat were creating new forms of French identity that went beyond feudal loyalty to kings and lords. The English had won battles and conquered territories, but they had also awakened something that would prove far more dangerous than armored knights or siege engines. French national consciousness, forged in the furnace of defeat and humiliation, was beginning to emerge as a force that could mobilize entire populations for sustained resistance. The war that had begun as a dynastic dispute was transforming into something unprecedented in European history, a conflict between emerging nations fighting not just for territorial advantage, but for their very identity and survival. As the first phase of the 100 Years' War drew to its close with the Treaty of Bretigny, observers throughout Europe struggled to understand what they had witnessed. The military innovations were clear enough. Longbows had defeated heavy cavalry, professional armies had outmaneuvered feudal levies, and systematic strategy had triumphed over individual heroism. But the deeper implications remained hidden, like seeds planted in soil that would not bear fruit for generations. The medieval world of personal loyalty and feudal obligation was dying, killed by the very conflicts that had once seemed to exemplify its values. In its place, something new was being born, a world of centralized states, national armies, and popular sovereignty that would reshape not just Europe, but human civilization itself. The English had won the first phase of their Great War, but their victories had set in motion forces that would ultimately transform both victor and vanquished in ways that no one could yet imagine. The Treaty of Bretigny had been meant to end the war, but like so many medieval peace agreements, it merely transformed conflict from one form into another. What emerged from the ashes of French defeat was not the submissive client state that English negotiators had envisioned, but something far more dangerous. A kingdom that had learned from catastrophe and was systematically rebuilding itself according to new principles that would revolutionize European statecraft. The key to understanding this remarkable transformation lay in the person who ascended the French throne following his father's death in English captivity. Charles V, who would become known to history as the Wise, was everything that medieval kingship was not supposed to produce. Physically frail and intellectually brilliant, he possessed neither the martial prowess that had defined royal leadership for centuries, nor the imposing presence that commanded respect in tournament and battlefield. What he did possess was a mind capable of understanding that the old ways of warfare and governance had failed catastrophically, and that France's survival depended on abandoning cherished traditions in favor of cold pragmatism. Charles V's revolution began with a systematic analysis of why France had lost so decisively in the war's first phase. The humiliations at Crécy and Poitiers had not been accidents or the result of individual cowardice, but symptoms of deeper structural problems that made French defeat almost inevitable. French armies had been organized around the individual prowess of noble knights, making them formidable in single combat but helpless against disciplined formations fighting coordinated tactics. French finances had been chaotic, dependent on irregular feudal obligations that could never match the systematic taxation that funded English military campaigns. Most importantly, French strategy had been reactive, always responding to English initiatives rather than seizing the offensive through superior planning and preparation. The new king's first crucial decision was to appoint Bertrand du Guesclin as Constable of France, a choice that represented a fundamental departure from traditional French military thinking. Du Guesclin was not a great nobleman with extensive lands and ancient bloodline, but a minor Breton knight whose only qualification was a genius for the kind of warfare that actually won campaigns. Where French nobles dreamed of glorious charges and single combat, Du Guesclin understood that war was ultimately about logistics, intelligence, and the patient accumulation of small advantages that could eventually produce decisive results. Du Guesclin's military philosophy represented everything that traditional chivalry despised. He avoided pitched battles whenever possible, preferring to wear down English forces through ambushes, raids, and the systematic destruction of their supply lines. His men fought like bandits rather than knights, striking without warning and melting away before enemies could respond. They showed no respect for the elaborate codes of honor that governed traditional warfare, treating English soldiers not as fellow warriors deserving respect, but as foreign invaders to be eliminated by any means necessary. This transformation in French military thinking coincided with a broader revolution in how the kingdom understood its own identity and purpose. The disasters of the previous decades had shattered many illusions about French superiority, but they had also created something unprecedented in European history: a sense of French national identity that transcended feudal loyalties and regional differences. Peasants who had never traveled beyond their village boundaries began to understand themselves as French in a way that their ancestors never had, united not just by language and custom, but by shared suffering and common enemies. The English, meanwhile, found themselves facing challenges that their early victories had not prepared them to handle. The Treaty of Bretigny had given them vast territories to govern, but governing conquered populations proved far more difficult than defeating their armies. English administrators, accustomed to the relatively straightforward task of ruling England's homogeneous population, struggled to maintain control over French territories, where every village contained potential rebels, and every administrative decision risked sparking new resistance. Edward the Black Prince, appointed to govern English territories in southwestern France, discovered that military genius did not necessarily translate into political wisdom. His attempts to raise revenue from his new subjects through heavy taxation sparked widespread resentment, while his reliance on English officials to administer French territories created a permanent class of disaffected local nobles who had been displaced from traditional positions of authority. The very success of English arms had created administrative burdens that strained the kingdom's resources and political capabilities. The Black Prince's involvement in the Castilian Civil War demonstrated how English success in France had created new opportunities for overreach that would ultimately prove disastrous. When Pedro the Cruel of Castile was overthrown by his half-brother, Henry of Trastamara, the conflict became a proxy war between English and French interests. The French supported Henry, seeing an opportunity to surround English-held Gascony with hostile territory, while the English backed Pedro as part of a broader strategy to isolate France diplomatically. The campaign that followed was everything that English military leaders could have hoped for in terms of immediate tactical success. The Black Prince led his army across the Pyrenees in a masterpiece of logistical planning, coordinating with Portuguese allies and Castilian loyalists to restore Pedro to his throne. The Battle of Nájera saw English longbowmen once again devastate their enemies, this time Spanish heavy cavalry rather than French, proving that English tactical innovations could succeed in any theatre of operations. But victory in Castile came at a cost that English strategists had not anticipated. The campaign drained English resources without providing any corresponding benefit to their position in France. Worse, the Black Prince's deteriorating health, already weakened by years of campaigning in hostile climates, was further damaged by the rigors of mountain warfare and exposure to diseases that English physicians could not treat. The heir to the English throne, the man whose military genius had made English dominance seem inevitable, was slowly dying from ailments that turned his greatest strength into debilitating weakness. The human cost of English expansion was becoming apparent in other ways as well. The professional armies that had won such spectacular victories required constant payment and supplies that strained English finances to the breaking point. The Italian banking houses that had financed Edward III's early campaigns were demanding repayment of loans that had accumulated interest for decades, while the taxation necessary to maintain English garrisons in France was creating political tensions that threatened domestic stability. Meanwhile, Charles V was implementing the systematic reforms that would transform France from a feudal kingdom to something approaching a modern state. The most revolutionary of these changes was the establishment of permanent taxation that allowed the crown to maintain standing forces independent of feudal obligations. French nobles, traditionally exempt from royal taxation, found themselves contributing to royal revenues whether they liked it or not. This was not merely a financial innovation, but a fundamental transformation in the relationship between crown and nobility that would have profound implications for European political development. The new French military system that emerged from these reforms was designed specifically to counter English advantages while exploiting English weaknesses. Rather than trying to match English longbowmen with superior archers, French military engineers focused on developing artillery that could break English defensive positions from ranges that made archery irrelevant. Rather than seeking decisive battles that English tactical superiority might win, French strategy emphasized the gradual reconquest of territory through sieges and raids that avoided English strengths while exploiting their administrative vulnerabilities. Du Guesclin's campaigns demonstrated the effectiveness of this new approach with methodical precision that slowly reversed decades of English gains. Rather than announcing his intentions with formal declarations of war, he simply began appearing wherever English garrisons were weakest, striking without warning and disappearing before reinforcements could arrive. English-held castles that had seemed impregnable when defended by full garrisons proved vulnerable when their defenders were stretched thin across too many positions. The psychology of this new form of warfare was as important as its tactical innovations. English soldiers, accustomed to the decisive victories that had made their reputation, found themselves fighting an enemy that refused to provide the kinds of climactic battles where English superiority could be demonstrated. Instead, they faced endless harassment, constant uncertainty, and the gradual erosion of positions that had once seemed secure. The confidence that had carried English armies to victory at Crécy and Poitiers began to evaporate as soldiers realized they were fighting an enemy that had learned from past defeats and adapted accordingly. The transformation was not limited to military affairs, but extended to every aspect of French government and society. Charles V established a professional diplomatic corps that could coordinate French policy across multiple theatres of operation, from Scotland to Castile to the Italian states. French agents began appearing in every court where English influence might be challenged, offering subsidies to potential allies and intelligence about English weaknesses. What had once been a relatively straightforward bilateral conflict was becoming a complex European war, where England found itself increasingly isolated. The naval dimension of this broader conflict demonstrated how completely the strategic situation had shifted since the early days of English dominance. French shipbuilders, working with Castilian and Portuguese allies, developed new vessel designs that could challenge English control of crucial sea routes. The English fleet that had dominated the Channel since Sly's suddenly faced coordinated attacks from multiple directions that stretched their resources beyond their capacity to respond effectively. The Great Schism that divided the Catholic Church into competing papal lineages added another layer of complexity to the evolving conflict. England supported the Roman Pope, while France backed the Avignon papacy, transforming what had begun as a territorial dispute into something approaching a religious war. French diplomats exploited these religious divisions to build coalitions that isolated England, not just politically, but spiritually, presenting English claims as contrary to divine will, as expressed through the legitimate papal authority. The domestic consequences of prolonged warfare were becoming apparent in both kingdoms, but the burden fell differently on victor and vanquished. In France, the shared suffering of defeat and foreign occupation had created a sense of national unity that transcended traditional regional and class divisions. French peasants who had been brutalized by English chevauchés developed a hatred for foreign invaders that made them willing to support royal policies they might otherwise have resented. French nobles, having seen their military inadequacy exposed at Crécy and Poitiers, proved more willing to accept royal reforms that might restore their kingdom's strength. England, by contrast, faced the more complex challenge of managing success that had created new burdens without providing corresponding benefits to most of the population. The taxes necessary to maintain English garrisons in France fell heavily on English peasants who saw little direct benefit from continental conquests. The professional armies that had won such spectacular victories required constant payment that strained royal finances and created political tensions between crown and parliament. Most dangerously, the expectation of continued military success had created a political dynamic where any setback risked being seen as royal failure worthy of domestic rebellion. The peasants' revolt that erupted in England was directly connected to the financial and social pressures created by prolonged continental warfare. English peasants, already struggling with the economic disruptions caused by plague and demographic change, found themselves bearing increased tax burdens to finance military campaigns that seemed to benefit only the nobility. When royal tax collectors arrived in villages demanding payment for wars that had already lasted longer than most peasants' lifetimes, the result was an explosion of social violence that threatened the kingdom's internal stability. The revolt's suppression required military resources that might otherwise have been deployed in France, demonstrating how English expansion had created vulnerabilities that enemies could exploit. Charles V, informed by his intelligence networks about English domestic troubles, timed his military campaigns to coincide with periods when English attention was focused on internal problems rather than continental defense. As the strategic balance continued to shift, both kingdoms found themselves transformed by the very conflict they were fighting. France, having learned the bitter lessons of military defeat, was becoming a more centralized and effective state, capable of mobilizing resources on a scale that medieval kingdoms had never achieved. England, burdened by the costs of maintaining conquests that provided diminishing returns, was discovering that military success could create political problems as dangerous as military failure. The systematic French reconquest of English-held territories proceeded with methodical precision that demonstrated how completely French military thinking had evolved. Rather than attempting to recapture major strongholds through expensive and risky sieges, Du Guesclin focused on isolating English garrisons by controlling the countryside around them. English soldiers, cut off from supplies and reinforcements, found themselves defending positions that became increasingly untenable, as French control of surrounding territories made their situation hopeless. The fall of English positions was not sudden, but gradual, like snow melting in spring. Castles that had controlled strategic routes for decades suddenly found themselves surrounded by hostile territory, where English authority meant nothing. Garrisons that had once been reinforced regularly discovered that French raiders had made the roads too dangerous for supply convoys to traverse. Administrative centres that had governed English territories efficiently found their authority ignored by populations that had transferred their loyalty to French commanders who offered both protection and legitimacy. By the time English leaders fully understood what was happening, the process had advanced too far to reverse through conventional military action. The French had not simply recaptured lost territory, but had created new forms of political and military organization that made their gains virtually irreversible. The feudal levies that had once provided the backbone of medieval armies had been replaced by professional forces capable of sustained campaigning. The personal relationships that had once held medieval kingdoms together had been supplemented by institutional loyalties that could survive the death or defeat of individual leaders. The English response to these setbacks revealed how their early successes had created strategic rigidity that made adaptation difficult. English military doctrine remained focused on the decisive battles that had brought such spectacular victories in the war's early phases, making it difficult to develop effective responses to French strategies that deliberately avoided such confrontations. English administrative systems, designed to govern relatively homogeneous populations, proved inadequate for managing territories where every policy decision had to account for potentially hostile local reactions. Perhaps most significantly, English political culture had been shaped by generations of military success that made setbacks seem like temporary reversals, rather than symptoms of deeper strategic problems. English kings and nobles continued to plan campaigns based on assumptions about French military inferiority that were no longer valid, while French leaders systematically exploited these misperceptions to achieve strategic objectives that would have seemed impossible during the war's earlier phases. The transformation was not complete. Significant English territories remained under their control, and English military capabilities were still formidable when properly employed. But the initiative had shifted decisively to France, and with it, the psychological momentum that had sustained English expansion for nearly half a century. The kingdom that had once seemed destined to unite the English and French crowns under a single monarch now found itself fighting desperately to maintain positions that were becoming increasingly difficult to defend. As this phase of the conflict drew toward its close, observers throughout Europe began to understand that they were witnessing something unprecedented in medieval history. The French recovery was not simply the restoration of traditional royal authority, but the emergence of new forms of political organization that combined centralized efficiency with popular legitimacy. The institutions that Charles V had created to fight the English were becoming permanent features of French government that would outlive their creator and transform the nature of European statecraft. The war that had begun with English tactical innovations was ending this phase with French institutional innovations that proved equally revolutionary. Medieval Europe was giving way to something new, and the conflict between England and France was serving as the laboratory where modern state power was being born through trial, error, and the bitter necessity of survival, in an age when defeat meant not just the loss of territory, but the potential extinction of kingdoms and peoples. A strange peace descended upon Europe as the 14th century drew to its close, but it was the peace of exhaustion rather than resolution, the temporary stillness that follows a great storm while darker clouds gather on the horizon. The Treaty of Loylingham established a 28-year truce between England and France, yet this formal cessation of hostilities masked deeper currents of madness and violence that would prove more destructive than any battlefield carnage. In the capitals of both kingdoms, the very foundations of royal authority began to crack under pressures that no treaty could address. In France, the seeds of catastrophe had been planted in the mind of King Charles VI, the son of Charles the Wise, whose reign had begun with such promise that contemporaries called him Charles the Beloved. Young, handsome, and seemingly blessed with his father's intelligence, Charles VI had inherited a kingdom that was finally recovering from the disasters of the war's early phases. French armies under Du Guesclin had reclaimed most of the territories lost at Bretigny. French finances had been stabilized through systematic reform, and French prestige had been restored through careful diplomacy that isolated England from potential continental allies. But in the summer heat of a forest near Le Mans, as the young king rode with his court toward what should have been a routine military campaign, the fragile stability of the French monarchy shattered in a moment of inexplicable terror. A wild-eyed hermit emerged from the undergrowth to seize the king's bridle, crying warnings about betrayal and death that sent Charles into convulsions of rage and fear. When a page accidentally dropped a lance, the clatter of steel on steel triggered something in the king's mind that transformed him from rational monarch to raving madman in the space of a heartbeat. The king's first attack of madness was brief, but terrifying in its implications. For several hours, Charles VI recognized no one, attacked his own attendants with drawn sword, and spoke in voices that seemed to belong to demons rather than the anointed king of France. When the episode passed, leaving him weak and confused, the court pretended that nothing had happened, that the king had simply suffered from heat exhaustion or temporary illness. But those who witnessed the transformation understood that they had seen something that called into question the very nature of royal authority and divine sanction. The sporadic nature of Charles VI's madness made it even more destabilizing than consistent incapacity would have been. For months at a time, the king would appear perfectly normal, conducting business with intelligence and decisiveness that reminded observers of his illustrious father. Then, without warning, the darkness would descend again, transforming the king into a creature that barely seemed human. During his worst episodes, Charles would refuse to bathe for months, believing that he was made of glass and would shatter if touched. He would run through the corridors of the Louvre howling like a wolf, or stand motionless for hours convinced that he was someone else entirely. Sometimes a peasant, sometimes a historical figure long dead, sometimes creatures that existed only in his fractured imagination. The political implications of royal madness in a medieval kingdom were profound beyond modern comprehension. The king was not merely the head of government, but the embodiment of divine authority on earth, the sacred intermediary between God and his people, whose every action carried supernatural significance. When that sacred figure began to manifest behaviors that suggested demonic possession or divine abandonment, the very legitimacy of the social order came into question. French nobles who had rallied around royal authority during the English wars now faced the horrifying possibility that their king had been abandoned by God, leaving them without the spiritual anchor that made their own authority meaningful. Into this void stepped figures whose ambitions had been constrained by strong royal authority, but who now saw opportunities to rebuild the French political system according to their own designs. The king's uncles, the Dukes of Burgundy, Berry, and Bourbon, had chafed under Charles the Wise's tight control of royal policy, but they had been forced to accept subordinate roles by a king whose competence made opposition futile. Now, with Charles VI's intermittent madness creating constant uncertainty about the source of legitimate authority, these princes began to position themselves as the true guardians of French interests. The most dangerous of these figures was Philip the Bold, Duke of Burgundy, whose territories stretched from the Low Countries through eastern France to the borders of the Holy Roman Empire. Philip had married Margaret of Flanders, making him one of the wealthiest and most powerful nobles in Europe, controlling trade routes and urban centres that generated revenues rivaling those of many kingdoms. His court at Dijon had become a centre of artistic and cultural innovation that attracted poets, painters, and scholars from across Europe, while his political networks extended from London to Prague to Rome. Burgundy's growing independence from French royal authority was facilitated by economic and cultural changes that were transforming medieval Europe in ways that made traditional feudal relationships increasingly obsolete. The Burgundian territories were at the heart of European trade networks that connected the wool producers of England with the cloth manufacturers of Flanders, the spice merchants of Venice with the banking houses of Florence, and the wine growers of France with the beer brewers of Germany. This commercial prosperity created new forms of wealth that were independent of royal favour and new sources of power that could challenge traditional royal prerogatives. The cultural sophistication of the Burgundian court also represented a challenge to French royal authority that was subtler but ultimately more dangerous than military opposition. The Dukes of Burgundy positioned themselves as patrons of a new chivalric culture that celebrated noble independence while paying only lip service to royal authority. The Order of the Golden Fleece, established by Philip the Bold's successor, became a kind of alternative nobility that drew its legitimacy from Burgundian rather than French royal authority. Knights who wore the golden fleece around their necks were making a statement about where their ultimate loyalties lay. Meanwhile, the king's brother, Louis, Duke of Orleans, emerged as the leader of a faction that sought to maintain royal authority against Burgundian encroachment, while pursuing its own agenda of military adventure and territorial expansion. Louis was everything that the intermittently mad king could not be: young, charismatic, militarily capable, and possessed of the kind of grand ambitions that could inspire noble followers. His marriage to Valentina Visconti connected him to Italian political networks and provided him with financial resources that made him a formidable rival to Burgundian power. The rivalry between Burgundy and Orleans was initially contained within the traditional forms of court politics, but the king's madness made compromise and accommodation increasingly difficult. When Charles VI was lucid, he could mediate between competing factions and maintain the delicate balance that prevented civil war. But during his periods of incapacity, France effectively had no king, leaving ambitious nobles free to pursue their own agendas without royal restraint. The result was a gradual escalation of tensions that transformed political competition into something approaching military confrontation. The names that the competing factions eventually adopted revealed the fundamental nature of their conflict. The Burgundian party became known as the Armagnacs after Bernard VII, Count of Armagnac, who became Louis of Orléans' father-in-law and military leader. The Orléans party, by contrast, retained the name of their martyred leader even after his death, becoming simply the Orléans faction. But these designations concealed the fact that this was not merely a dispute between noble houses, but a fundamental disagreement about the nature of French royal authority and France's role in European politics. The Burgundian position represented a kind of proto-federalism that would have transformed France into something resembling the Holy Roman Empire, with powerful regional princes exercising quasi-independent authority while paying nominal allegiance to a weakened crown. The Armagnac position, by contrast, sought to preserve and strengthen the centralized monarchy that Charles the Wise had created, using royal authority to subordinate noble ambitions to broader national interests. The stakes were nothing less than the future structure of the French state, and France's ability to function as a unified power in European politics. Across the English Channel, England was experiencing its own crisis of royal authority, though the symptoms were political rather than medical. Richard II had inherited his grandfather Edward III's throne as a child, ruling through regencies that had allowed powerful nobles to accumulate influence and wealth, while the kingdom drifted without strong leadership. As Richard came of age and attempted to assert personal control over government, he discovered that the very nobles who had governed in his name were reluctant to surrender the powers they had exercised during his minority. Richard's personality and political instincts made this transition from regency to personal rule particularly traumatic for the English political system. Where his predecessors had been warriors who led from the front and earned noble loyalty through military success, Richard was an aesthete who preferred art and literature to warfare and diplomacy. His court became a center of cultural refinement that produced some of the finest poetry and art in English history. But this cultural flowering came at the cost of political effectiveness and military readiness. The king's attempts to create a more sophisticated and centralized form of royal government brought him into conflict with nobles who had grown accustomed to the relative independence they had enjoyed during his minority. Richard's use of household officials to bypass traditional noble advisors, his creation of new titles and honors that diluted the status of established peers, and his apparent preference for peace over military glory all contributed to growing tensions between crown and nobility. The crisis came to a head when a group of powerful nobles, known to history as the Lords Appellant, accused Richard's closest advisors of treason and demanded their removal from court. The king's initial resistance to these demands led to armed confrontation at Radcot Bridge, where royal forces were defeated by noble armies led by Richard's own uncle, Thomas of Woodstock, Duke of Gloucester. The humiliation of seeing his supporters killed or executed while he was forced to accept noble oversight of his government left psychological scars that would shape Richard's behavior for the rest of his reign. The merciless parliament that followed Radcot Bridge represented one of the most dramatic assertions of noble power over royal authority in English history. The Lords Appellant, acting through a parliament that they controlled completely, proceeded to execute or exile virtually everyone connected to Richard's personal government. The king himself was forced to watch helplessly as men who had served him faithfully were condemned to death for the crime of carrying out royal policies. The message was unmistakable. English kings ruled by noble sufferance, and royal authority that exceeded noble tolerance would be met with force. Richard's response to this humiliation was to retreat into a shell of resentment and paranoia that gradually transformed him from an ineffective but relatively benign ruler into a tyrant whose arbitrary exercise of power threatened the very foundations of English government. The king began to surround himself with bodyguards whose loyalty was purchased rather than earned, to rule through favoritism and fear rather than law and custom, and to pursue personal vendettas against anyone who had opposed him during the crisis of the Lords Appellant. The transformation of Richard II from weak king to tyrant was facilitated by the same economic and social changes that were destabilizing France. The English economy had been fundamentally altered by the Black Death and the subsequent labor shortages that gave surviving peasants unprecedented bargaining power. Traditional relationships between lords and peasants had been strained to the breaking point by economic pressures that made ancient customs seem irrelevant, while new forms of wealth based on trade and manufacturing created social mobility that challenged established hierarchies. The peasants' revolt had demonstrated how quickly these underlying tensions could explode into violence that threatened the entire social order. Richard's handling of that crisis, his personal courage in facing the rebels combined with his ruthless suppression of the uprising, once immediate danger had passed, revealed both his potential for effective leadership and his capacity for vindictive cruelty. The young king, who had promised pardons to rebel leaders and then broken those promises once they were in his power, was capable of duplicity that made him dangerous to anyone who trusted royal word. As Richard's reign progressed, his increasing reliance on arbitrary power created a political dynamic that made violent confrontation almost inevitable. The king's creation of a private army, loyal only to himself, his use of forced loans to finance government without parliamentary consent, and his manipulation of the legal system to destroy political enemies, all contributed to growing noble conviction that Richard had forfeited his right to rule through violation of the fundamental laws and customs that limited royal power. The final crisis began when Richard attempted to use his accumulated power to destroy the last of his enemies from the time of the Lords Appellant. The exile of Henry Bolingbroke, son of John of Gaunt, and therefore Richard's cousin, might have seemed like a relatively minor exercise of royal prerogative. But when John of Gaunt died, and Richard seized the Lancastrian inheritance instead of allowing it to pass to the exiled Henry, he violated property rights that were fundamental to the entire noble order. If the king could arbitrarily confiscate the lands of England's greatest noble house, then no noble property was safe from royal predation. Henry Bolingbroke's invasion of England was therefore not simply a personal quest for restoration, but a defense of principles that transcended individual interests. When Henry landed at Ravenspur with a small force of supporters, he claimed to be seeking only the restoration of his rightful inheritance, but his rapid accumulation of noble support demonstrated that his cause represented broader concerns about the nature and limits of royal power. The speed with which Richard's support collapsed revealed how completely the king had alienated the very nobles whose loyalty was essential to effective royal government. The deposition of Richard II was accomplished with procedural care that emphasized the legal rather than simply military nature of the revolution. Parliament was summoned to hear formal charges against the king, ranging from violation of his coronation oath to misgovernment that had brought the kingdom to the brink of ruin. Richard's abdication was presented as voluntary, though everyone understood that he had no real choice in the matter. The new king, Henry IV, was chosen not by right of primogeniture, but by parliamentary election, establishing a precedent that would have profound implications for the future development of English constitutional government. But Henry's usurpation, however legally justified, created its own problems that would plague his reign and that of his successor. The Lancastrian claim to the throne was based on parliamentary recognition, rather than unquestionable hereditary right, making it vulnerable to challenge by anyone who could present superior dynastic credentials. The Percys, the Welsh under Owain Glyndwr, and various other noble families all found reasons to rebel against a king whose title rested on recent parliamentary action rather than ancient bloodline. The parallel crises in England and France created opportunities for intervention and alliance that both kingdoms were too distracted to exploit effectively. French nobles seeking English support for their various factions found the English monarchy too concerned with domestic rebellion to provide meaningful assistance. English nobles, hoping to restore the kingdom's continental empire, discovered that France's civil wars made it impossible to identify reliable allies who could deliver on their promises. Meanwhile, the broader European political system was being transformed by crises that dwarfed even the domestic troubles of England and France. The Great Schism had divided the Catholic Church between rival papal courts at Rome and Avignon, with different kingdoms supporting different claimants to the papal throne based on political rather than religious considerations. The Council of Pisa's attempt to resolve this crisis by deposing both existing popes and electing a new one had succeeded only in creating 3 rival papal courts instead of 2, making the institutional chaos even worse. The implications of this ecclesiastical crisis extended far beyond matters of religious authority. Medieval kingship derived much of its legitimacy from divine sanction, expressed through papal recognition and church ceremony. When the church itself was divided and its authority questioned, the spiritual foundations of royal power became uncertain. Kings could no longer appeal to unquestionable religious authority to justify their political actions, forcing them to rely more heavily on military force and popular support to maintain their positions. The mercenary companies that had plagued Europe during earlier phases of the war found new opportunities for employment in the chaotic conditions that characterized this interregnum period. These routiers, as they were known, were professional soldiers whose loyalty was determined entirely by pay rather than feudal obligation or national identity. They served whoever could afford their services, changing sides with cynical regularity as political fortunes shifted and payment schedules were altered. The existence of these mercenary bands represented a fundamental challenge to traditional concepts of warfare and political authority. Medieval military theory assumed that soldiers fought for honor, feudal obligation, or religious conviction, motivations that created at least some constraints on military behavior and some connection between warriors and the societies they protected. But mercenaries fought purely for profit, making them willing to engage in forms of warfare that traditional knights would have considered dishonorable, while feeling no loyalty to the populations they were ostensibly defending. The free companies, as some of these mercenary bands called themselves, became virtual states within states, controlling territories and populations through military force while owing allegiance to no legitimate authority. Their leaders accumulated wealth and power that rivaled those of traditional nobles, but without the social responsibilities and cultural constraints that had traditionally limited noble behavior. The result was a form of organized predation that devastated entire regions, while contributing nothing to the political or social order that made civilization possible. As this strange period of official peace but unofficial warfare continued, both England and France began to develop new forms of political organization that would eventually prove more effective than the traditional structures they were replacing. In France, the Armagnac Party began to experiment with appeals to popular support that bypassed traditional noble intermediaries, while the Burgundians developed administrative techniques that emphasized efficiency over ceremony. In England, the Lancastrian kings learned to work with Parliament in ways that created genuine partnership between crown and legislature, rather than the confrontational relationship that had characterized previous reigns. These institutional innovations were driven by necessity rather than theory, as rulers struggling with domestic rebellion and foreign intervention discovered that traditional methods of government were inadequate to address the challenges they faced. The result was a gradual evolution toward more sophisticated and effective forms of statecraft that would eventually produce the strong monarchies and efficient administrations that would dominate the next phase of European political development. But these developments remained largely hidden beneath the surface chaos that characterized daily political life during this period. To contemporary observers, the late 14th and early 15th centuries seemed like an age of decline and dissolution, when ancient certainties were crumbling without being replaced by anything coherent or stable. The wars, rebellions, schisms, and dynastic disputes that dominated the headlines appeared to be symptoms of civilizational collapse, rather than growing pains of political evolution. The stage was being set for a renewal of the great Anglo-French conflict, but under conditions that would be fundamentally different from those that had characterized the war's earlier phases. Both kingdoms would bring to this new phase of conflict institutional innovations, military technologies, and political techniques that had been developed during their respective internal crises. The result would be warfare that was both more devastating and more decisive than anything Europe had previously experienced, as the lessons learned during this period of madness and interlude were applied to the ancient rivalry between the two greatest powers in Western Europe. From the chaos and madness of the previous decades emerged a figure who seemed to embody everything that medieval kingship was meant to represent, yet who would prove to be something entirely new in the evolution of European monarchy. Henry V of England was 26 years old when he inherited his father's usurped throne. But behind his youth lay a political intelligence and military genius that would reshape the map of Europe and redefine the very nature of royal power. Where his father, Henry IV, had spent his reign defending a questioned legitimacy against domestic rebellion, Henry V would transform that weakness into strength by channeling English martial energy toward the ancient dream of French conquest. The new king understood instinctively that foreign victory was the surest path to domestic legitimacy. The Lancastrian dynasty's questionable claim to the English throne would be forgotten if Henry could succeed where even Edward III had ultimately failed, in making himself the undisputed King of France as well as England. But Henry's approach to this ancient ambition was informed by lessons that previous English kings had never learned, shaped by a political sophistication that combined medieval concepts of honor with modern understanding of power. Henry V was a creature of contradictions that contemporaries struggled to comprehend. In his private chambers, he was a scholar who could debate theology with university masters and compose music that moved courtiers to tears. In council meetings, he displayed a grasp of administrative detail that rivaled the most experienced bureaucrats. On the battlefield, he became something approaching a force of nature, inspiring fanatical loyalty in his soldiers, while demonstrating a capacity for calculated brutality that shocked even hardened warriors. These were not different aspects of his personality, but facets of a single intelligence that understood power in all its forms and was willing to use whatever tools proved most effective. The diplomatic preparation for Henry's French campaigns demonstrated this synthesis of intellectual sophistication and practical ruthlessness. Rather than simply renewing Old English claims to the French throne, Henry's agents worked systematically to construct legal, political, and moral justifications for war that would resonate with every constituency that mattered. English lawyers produced elaborate genealogical arguments that made Henry's claims seem not just legitimate, but divinely ordained. English diplomats negotiated alliances with Burgundian and other French factions that would provide both military support and political cover for English intervention. English propagandists crafted narratives that presented the coming war not as aggression, but as the restoration of rightful authority stolen by Valois usurpers. The France that Henry planned to invade was still consumed by the civil war between Armagnacs and Burgundians that had made effective resistance to foreign intervention almost impossible. The assassination of Louis of Orléans by Burgundian agents had escalated noble rivalry into something approaching a war of extermination, with each faction seeking to destroy rather than merely defeat their domestic enemies. French royal authority, already weakened by Charles VI's intermittent madness, had effectively collapsed in many regions where competing noble armies fought for control of towns, castles, and revenue sources. Henry's intelligence networks, far more sophisticated than anything previous English kings had employed, provided detailed information about these French weaknesses and how they might be exploited. English agents at the French court reported on the king's mental state, the shifting loyalties of noble factions, and the strategic implications of various political developments. English merchants trading in French territories gathered information about economic conditions, military preparations, and popular attitudes toward potential English intervention. English diplomats maintained contact with both Armagnac and Burgundian representatives, playing each faction against the other while positioning England as the potential arbiter of French political disputes. The military preparations for the coming campaign reflected the same attention to detail and understanding of changing warfare that characterized Henry's diplomatic efforts. The English army that assembled for the invasion of France was smaller than the great hosts that Edward III had led across the Channel, but it was also more professional, better equipped, and more systematically organized than any military force in European history. Every soldier was carefully selected for specific military skills. Every piece of equipment was standardized for maximum effectiveness, and every aspect of logistics was planned with mathematical precision. The evolution of English military technology since the early phases of the war was evident in every detail of Henry's preparations. The longbows that had devastated French cavalry at Crécy and Poitiers had been refined through decades of continuous warfare, with improvements in bow design, arrow manufacture, and tactical deployment that made them even more deadly than their predecessors. But Henry's army also included the latest innovations in siege warfare, including early cannons that could breach castle walls that had previously been impregnable, and engineers capable of constructing fortifications that incorporated these new technologies. More importantly, Henry had learned from the strategic mistakes that had undermined previous English successes in France. Where Edward III had pursued spectacular victories that proved impossible to consolidate into permanent gains, Henry planned a systematic conquest that would establish English administration over captured territories before moving on to new objectives. Where the Black Prince had allowed his forces to be dispersed across too many theatres of operation, Henry concentrated his efforts on achieving decisive results in carefully chosen areas where success would have maximum political and military impact. The landing at Harfleur in Normandy announced these new strategic priorities with symbolic precision. Rather than striking directly at the French heartland as previous English invasions had done, Henry chose to begin his conquest with the systematic reduction of fortified positions that controlled access to the Seine River Valley. Harfleur was not simply a military target, but the key to English control of Normandy's economic and strategic resources. a base from which subsequent operations could be supplied and reinforced without depending on vulnerable communications across the English Channel. The siege of Harfleur demonstrated both the capabilities and limitations of Henry's new military system. English artillery, still primitive by later standards, proved capable of breaching medieval fortifications with patience and systematic application. English logistics, carefully planned and efficiently executed, maintained the besieging army through months of operations without the supply failures that had plagued previous English campaigns. English discipline, enforced through a legal code that combined medieval concepts of honor with practical military necessity, prevented the kind of predatory behavior that had undermined previous English efforts to win French popular support. But the siege also revealed how much warfare had changed since the heroic age of Crécy and Poitiers. This was not a matter of knightly valor or individual prowess, but of engineering skill, administrative efficiency, and the patient application of superior resources. The defenders of Harfleur fought with desperate courage against enemies who methodically destroyed their walls and systematically intercepted their supplies. When the city finally surrendered, it was not because French bravery had failed, but because English organization had made continued resistance futile. The cost of this victory, however, proved almost as devastating to the victors as to the vanquished. The siege had consumed months that Henry could not afford to lose, while disease had ravaged his army in ways that enemy action had not. The dysentery that swept through English camps was no respecter of rank or reputation, killing seasoned veterans and noble commanders with the same efficiency that had once been the exclusive province of enemy weapons. By the time Harfleur surrendered, Henry's army had been reduced from the magnificent force that had landed in Normandy to a shadow of its former strength. The decision to march across northern France toward Calais with this depleted army was either military genius or royal madness, depending on perspective and outcome. Henry's advisors urged him to return to England with the victory he had already achieved, to consolidate his gains and return the following year with a fresh army capable of continuing the conquest. But Henry understood that political momentum was as important as military strength, that a defensive strategy would allow French factions to reconcile their differences and coordinate effective resistance to future English operations. The march toward Calais was intended to demonstrate English freedom of movement within France, while avoiding the kind of major battle that Henry's reduced army might not survive. English forces moved quickly through the French countryside, burning and looting in the traditional manner of chevauchée warfare, but always staying ahead of French attempts to bring them to battle. This was not conquest, but psychological warfare, designed to humiliate French leaders by showing their inability to protect their own territories from a relatively small English force. The strategy might have succeeded if French political dysfunction had continued to prevent coordinated military response. But the spectacle of English soldiers ravaging the French countryside, while French armies failed to intervene, finally overcame the political divisions that had paralyzed French resistance. The Constable of France, Charles d'Albret, managed to assemble a force that combined Armagnac and Burgundian elements in temporary alliance against the foreign invader. For the first time since the resumption of hostilities, English forces would face a French army that was both numerically superior and politically unified. The armies converged near the village of Agincourt on a rain-soaked field that seemed to embody all the misery and futility of medieval warfare. The English, exhausted by weeks of marching and weakened by disease, found themselves trapped between superior French forces and terrain that offered no possibility of escape. The French, confident that they finally had the opportunity to reverse decades of military humiliation, prepared for the kind of overwhelming victory that would restore their kingdom's prestige and end English pretensions to continental empire. The Battle of Agincourt unfolded like a nightmare version of Crécy, with all the tactical elements of the earlier battle compressed into even more horrific proportions. French knights, constrained by muddy conditions that made mounted charges impossible, advanced on foot toward English positions that had been carefully prepared to channel attacks into killing zones. The longbowmen who had made English military reputation were still present in devastating numbers, their arrows creating fields of death that no amount of courage could cross. But the slaughter at Agincourt exceeded even Crécy in its systematic efficiency and psychological impact. The mud that made the battlefield nearly impassable for heavily armoured French knights became a deadly trap that held victims motionless while English arrows found every gap in their armour. French nobles, who had trained their entire lives for glorious combat, found themselves drowning in French soil, weighed down by armour that had become their coffin rather than their protection. The flower of French chivalry, representing bloodlines that stretched back to Charlemagne and beyond, was systematically exterminated by English yeomen whose names would never be recorded in any chronicle of noble deeds. Henry's personal conduct during the battle revealed the complex nature of his character and the calculating intelligence that underlay his apparent warrior passion. When French attacks threatened to overwhelm English positions, the king fought with desperate valor that inspired his men to superhuman efforts. But when French resistance began to collapse and the battle's outcome became clear, Henry ordered the execution of French prisoners with cold-blooded pragmatism that shocked contemporary observers. This was not the random brutality of undisciplined soldiers, but calculated policy designed to prevent captured enemies from rejoining the fight if French reinforcements arrived. The massacre of French prisoners at Agincourt violated every convention of medieval warfare and chivalric honor. But it also demonstrated Henry's understanding that this war was about political survival rather than knightly glory. The French nobles who died as prisoners would have been worth enormous ransoms if treated according to traditional customs, but they would also have represented continuing military and political threats if allowed to survive. Henry's decision to sacrifice immediate financial gain for long-term strategic advantage revealed a mind capable of calculations that transcended medieval concepts of honorable warfare. The aftermath of Agincourt sent shockwaves through European politics that exceeded even the impact of Crécy and Poitiers. French losses included not just individual nobles, but entire bloodlines that had shaped French politics for centuries. The Duke of Alençon, the Count of Nevers, the Constable of France himself. These were not merely military casualties, but political disasters that left French resistance leaderless and demoralized. More than 6,000 French soldiers lay dead on the muddy field, while English losses were reported as fewer than 30 men, a ratio so overwhelming that many refused to believe contemporary accounts. But Henry understood that military victory was meaningless without political follow-up that could transform battlefield success into permanent strategic advantage. Rather than pursuing the broken French army, he immediately began the systematic conquest of Normandy that would provide the foundation for English control of northern France. This was not the hasty exploitation of temporary opportunity, but the methodical implementation of plans that had been developed long before Agincourt made their execution possible. The conquest of Normandy proceeded with mechanical efficiency that demonstrated how completely English military thinking had evolved since the early phases of the war. Henry's forces moved from stronghold to stronghold with methodical precision, using siege techniques that combined traditional medieval methods with the latest innovations in artillery and engineering. Each captured position was immediately incorporated into an English administrative system that replaced French officials with English ones, while maintaining the local institutions that made government actually function. The political dimension of this conquest was equally sophisticated. Henry presented himself not as a foreign conqueror, but as the rightful Duke of Normandy, reclaiming his inheritance from Valois usurpers. English administration was organized to provide better justice and more efficient government than French rule had offered, winning the support of populations that had suffered under the chaos of French civil war. English legal systems were implemented that protected property rights and commercial interests more effectively than French alternatives, creating economic incentives for collaboration with the new regime. The diplomatic triumph that crowned these military and administrative successes was the Treaty of Troy, an agreement that represented the closest any English king had come to achieving the dream of uniting the English and French crowns under a single ruler. The treaty was made possible by the continued political dysfunction of the French court, where the rivalry between Armagnacs and Burgundians had reached such intensity that each faction preferred alliance with England to submission to their domestic enemies. The Duke of Burgundy, Philip the Good, had emerged as the key figure in French politics following his father's assassination by Armagnac agents. Philip's alliance with England was motivated not by any affection for English interests, but by determination to destroy the Armagnac faction that had murdered his father and threatened Burgundian independence. The Duke's territories in the Low Countries and eastern France were wealthy enough to function as an independent state, but they required English military support to resist Armagnac attempts at reconquest. The terms of the Treaty of Troy were so favourable to English interests that they seemed to represent the complete fulfilment of Edward III's original ambitions. Henry V would marry Catherine of Valois, daughter of the Mad King Charles VI, and would be recognised as heir to the French throne in place of the Dauphin Charles, who was declared illegitimate and disinherited. Upon Charles VI's death, Henry would become King of France as well as England, uniting the two crowns under English authority for the first time since the Norman conquest. But the treaty also revealed the limitations of even the most spectacular military success when faced with the new political realities that were emerging in late medieval Europe. The Dauphin Charles, despite being formally disinherited, maintained control of central and southern France with the support of populations that increasingly identified themselves as French, rather than simply subjects of whatever king happened to occupy the throne. The sense of French national identity that had been emerging since the disasters of the 14th century could not be eliminated by diplomatic agreements or military victories. Henry's marriage to Catherine of Valois was celebrated with magnificent ceremony that seemed to symbolize the permanent union of the two kingdoms under English rule. The wedding festivities at Troy Cathedral brought together English and French nobles in displays of friendship and alliance that suggested the ancient enmity between the two peoples had finally been resolved through royal marriage and diplomatic accommodation. But beneath these ceremonial displays lay deeper currents of resistance that no treaty could address. The systematic English conquest of northern France continued even after the Treaty of Troy, as Henry worked to transform diplomatic recognition into administrative reality. English officials replaced French ones throughout Normandy and the surrounding regions, while English settlers were encouraged to emigrate to newly conquered territories. English became the language of government and law in regions that had been French for centuries, while English customs and institutions were imposed on populations that had never known foreign rule. Yet even at the moment of his greatest triumph, Henry V was beginning to understand that military conquest was easier than political consolidation, that winning battles was simpler than governing the populations whose armies had been defeated. The administrative burden of ruling two kingdoms simultaneously was proving almost impossible to manage, while the financial costs of maintaining English garrisons in France were straining English resources beyond their capacity to bear. The king's death in the castle of Vincennes, struck down by dysentery at the height of his power and success, represented one of those moments when individual mortality shapes the destiny of nations. Henry V had achieved everything that medieval kingship was supposed to accomplish: military glory, territorial conquest, diplomatic triumph, and royal marriage that promised to unite hostile peoples under common rule. But his death left these achievements in the hands of an infant son who inherited vast responsibilities without any of the personal qualities that had made Henry's success possible. The news of Henry's death sent shockwaves through English-controlled territories in France that revealed how much their security had depended on his personal leadership and political intelligence. French populations that had accepted English rule while Henry lived began to question whether that acceptance would continue under a regency government ruling in the name of a child king. English administrators who had derived their authority from Henry's presence discovered that their power was less secure than they had imagined. More ominously for English interests, the death of Henry V coincided with growing signs that French resistance was evolving beyond traditional forms of noble rebellion into something approaching popular national uprising. The Dauphin Charles, despite his formal disinheritance, was beginning to attract support from social groups that had never before played significant roles in French politics. Peasants, merchants, and urban craftsmen were beginning to identify with a vision of French independence that transcended feudal loyalties and regional differences. The stage was set for a new phase of the conflict that would test whether English military and administrative innovations could survive the loss of the exceptional leader who had created them. The infant Henry VI inherited claims to two kingdoms, but he also inherited problems that would prove beyond the capacity of even the most capable regency government to resolve. The greatest English victory in the war's history had created opportunities and obligations that would ultimately contribute to the most devastating English defeat. The death of Henry V had left his infant son heir to two kingdoms and a dream that was already crumbling at its foundations. Little Henry VI, barely 9 months old when he inherited the crowns of England and France, ruled through regents who possessed neither his father's genius for warfare nor his talent for inspiring loyalty in conquered populations. The Duke of Bedford, governing English territories in France as regent, was a capable administrator and experienced soldier, but he lacked the almost supernatural charisma that had made Henry V seem invincible to both friend and enemy. In the councils of English-held Paris, the whispered question that no one dared voice aloud was whether English rule in France had died with the king who created it. The France that Bedford attempted to govern was a land divided not just by political allegiance, but by competing visions of what the kingdom itself should become. In the north, English administration had brought stability and prosperity to regions that had been devastated by decades of civil war. Norman merchants who had watched their trade routes disappear during the Armagnac-Burgundian conflicts found them restored under English rule. Peasants who had seen their crops burned by competing French armies discovered that English law provided better protection for their property than French custom had ever offered. For these populations, English rule represented not foreign occupation, but deliverance from the chaos that French politics had created. But south of the Loire River, a different France was emerging under the leadership of the disinherited Dauphin Charles, a France that drew its strength not from administrative efficiency or military innovation, but from something that English strategists had never encountered before: the power of popular nationalism fused with religious conviction. The Dauphin's court at Bourges was a shabby affair compared to the magnificent establishments that English regents maintained in Paris and Rouen, but it was becoming the focal point for a form of resistance that transcended traditional feudal loyalties and regional identities. Charles VII, as the Dauphin styled himself despite the Treaty of Troyes, was an unlikely figure to inspire the kind of devotion that could challenge English military supremacy. Physically unprepossessing and politically uncertain, he had been declared illegitimate by his own parents and abandoned by many of his traditional supporters. His court was filled with nobles whose loyalty was questionable and advisors whose competence was limited. His treasury was chronically empty, his armies were poorly equipped, and his political prospects seemed so hopeless that many contemporary observers assumed that English victory was simply a matter of time. Yet beneath the surface of apparent French collapse, forces were gathering that would ultimately prove more powerful than all of Henry V's tactical innovations and administrative reforms. The prolonged English occupation had created something that France had never possessed before: a sense of national identity that was independent of royal authority and capable of surviving military defeat. French peasants who had never thought of themselves as anything more than subjects of local lords were beginning to understand that they were part of a larger community that extended beyond their immediate experience. French merchants who had accepted English rule for practical reasons were beginning to question whether temporary prosperity was worth permanent subjugation to foreign authority. Most importantly, the French church was beginning to articulate a theological justification for resistance that transformed political rebellion into religious obligation. French clergy, who had initially accepted English rule as divinely ordained, were increasingly arguing that God could not intend for the most Christian kingdom of France to remain permanently subject to heretical English authority. The cult of Saint Denis, patron saint of France, experienced a revival that explicitly linked French independence to divine will, while popular preachers began to prophesy that God would send a miraculous deliverer to restore the kingdom to its rightful ruler. Into this atmosphere of expectation and desperation came reports of a peasant girl from Domremy who claimed to have received visions from Saints Michael, Margaret, and Catherine, commanding her to drive the English from France and see the Dauphin crowned at Reims Cathedral. Joan of Arc was 17 years old when she first approached local officials with her extraordinary claims. A teenager from a prosperous farming family whose only qualifications for military leadership were her absolute conviction that she had been chosen by God and her complete ignorance of the reasons why such a mission was impossible. The story of Joan's journey from obscure village to the Dauphin's court has been told so many times that it has acquired the quality of legend, but the political and military circumstances that made her rise possible were rooted in very practical considerations that had nothing to do with divine intervention. The siege of Orléans, which had begun in the autumn after Henry IV's death, represented the crucial test of whether English military supremacy could survive the transition from personal to institutional leadership. If Orléans fell, English forces would control the Loire River Valley and could complete the conquest of central France that Henry V had begun. If the siege failed, English momentum would be broken, and French resistance would gain the kind of symbolic victory that could transform military morale throughout the kingdom. The English forces surrounding Orléans were a professional army that embodied everything that had made English military success possible during the previous phases of the war. Their commanders were veterans of Henry V's campaigns who understood siege warfare. Their soldiers were disciplined professionals who could maintain operations through winter conditions that would have dispersed medieval armies. And their siege engines included the latest innovations in artillery that could breach walls that had previously been impregnable. By every measure that medieval military science recognized, the fall of Orleans was inevitable, but the siege had dragged on for months without achieving decisive results, revealing problems that English military doctrine had not anticipated. The city's defenders, led by Jean de Dunois, the bastard of Orleans, fought with desperate determination that reflected their understanding that this was not simply another siege, but a battle for the survival of French independence. More importantly, the surrounding countryside remained largely hostile to English occupation, making it impossible to establish the kind of systematic blockade that traditional siege warfare required. English foraging parties faced constant harassment from irregular forces that melted away when confronted but reappeared whenever English attention was focused elsewhere. The arrival of Joan at the Dauphin's court coincided with a crisis of morale that threatened to destroy French resistance even without military defeat. The Dauphin's advisors were divided between those who favored continued resistance and those who argued for negotiated surrender that might preserve some vestige of French autonomy under English overlordship. Financial resources were exhausted, military recruitment had virtually ceased, and popular support for the Dauphin's cause was eroding as English administration demonstrated its superiority to the chaos that had characterized French government during the previous decades. Joan's examination by theologians and court officials at Chinon revealed the complexity of medieval attitudes toward divine revelation and political authority. The girl's claims were simultaneously shocking and plausible in a culture that accepted direct communication between heaven and earth as a documented historical reality. Saints had appeared to kings and peasants throughout Christian history, and the idea that God might intervene directly in human affairs to protect the most Christian kingdom was entirely consistent with contemporary theological understanding. But the specific nature of Joan's mission, a peasant girl commanding nobles and leading armies, violated every assumption about social hierarchy and gender roles that medieval society took for granted. The theological examination concluded that Joan's visions were genuine, but this conclusion reflected political calculation as much as religious conviction. The Dauphin's court desperately needed something that could revive popular enthusiasm for their cause, and a divinely inspired peasant girl represented exactly the kind of miraculous intervention that could capture popular imagination. More practically, Joan's insistence that she had been sent to lift the siege of Orleans provided a clear military objective that could test whether her claims had any substance beyond religious enthusiasm. The transformation of Joan from visionary peasant to military commander required a complete reconstruction of her public persona that reflected both medieval understanding of divine authority and practical political necessities. She was provided with armor, horses, and a military household appropriate to her claimed status as God's representative, while her humble origins were reinterpreted as evidence of divine humility rather than social inadequacy. Most importantly, she was surrounded by experienced military advisors who could translate her inspiration into practical tactical decisions while maintaining the fiction that she was directing rather than following their professional judgment. The relief expedition that set out for Orleans was the largest force that the Dauphin had been able to assemble in years, but it was still significantly smaller than the English army that it intended to confront. What made the expedition formidable was not its size, but its morale, which had been transformed by Joan's presence from resigned desperation to confident expectation of victory. French soldiers who had fought defensive campaigns for decades suddenly believed that they were advancing as God's army to achieve divinely guaranteed triumph over heretical invaders. The lifting of the siege of Orléans unfolded like a military miracle that seemed to confirm every prophecy about divine intervention in human affairs. The English positions that had seemed impregnable for months suddenly became vulnerable as French attacks achieved coordination and intensity that surprised even their own commanders. English soldiers who had maintained discipline through the worst conditions found their morale cracking as they faced enemies who fought with religious fervor that made death in battle seem preferable to retreat or surrender. The key to understanding what happened at Orléans lies not in supernatural intervention, but in the psychological transformation that Joan's presence created in both armies. French forces that had been fighting defensively for years suddenly went on the offensive with tactical coordination that reflected months of careful planning by professional soldiers. English forces that had grown accustomed to French passivity found themselves facing aggressive assaults that exploited weaknesses in siege positions that had never been seriously tested. The result was not a miraculous reversal of military capability, but the emergence of French tactical competence that had been suppressed by defeatist expectations. The English withdrawal from Orléans was not a rout, but a strategic retreat by professional soldiers who recognized that their position had become untenable. The siege works that had taken months to construct were abandoned in good order, while the army that had maintained them retreated to positions where they could not be attacked by superior numbers fighting on interior lines. From a purely military perspective, the English response to changing circumstances was competent and professional, reflecting the kind of tactical flexibility that had made their armies successful throughout the war. But the political implications of the English retreat were devastating in ways that military analysis could not capture. The siege of Orléans had been presented by English propaganda as the inevitable culmination of their conquest of France, while French resistance had invested the city's survival with symbolic significance that transcended its strategic importance. When English forces withdrew after months of siege operations, they were admitting not just tactical failure, but political defeat that called into question the fundamental premises of English rule in France. Joan's subsequent campaigns during the late spring and early summer, following the relief of Orléans, demonstrated how completely the strategic situation in central France had been transformed. The Loire River Valley, which had been the intended route for English expansion southward, instead became the theatre for a French offensive that recaptured strongholds that had been in English hands for years. Jargeau, Meung-sur-Loire, Beaugency. These were not simply military objectives, but symbols of French resurgence that attracted recruits from throughout the kingdom to Joan's banner. The Battle of Patay represented the culmination of this French offensive and the most complete reversal of tactical fortunes that the war had yet witnessed. English forces under Sir John Fastolf and the Earl of Suffolk, veterans of Agincourt and countless other engagements, found themselves surprised and overwhelmed by French cavalry attacking with coordination and determination that recalled the great days of French military supremacy. The battle lasted only minutes, but its results included thousands of English casualties and the capture of leading English commanders who had seemed almost invincible during the previous phases of the conflict. More significant than the immediate military results was the demonstration that English tactical advantages were not permanent features of the strategic landscape, but temporary developments that could be overcome by French adaptation and superior numbers. The longbowmen, who had dominated European battlefields for nearly a century, proved vulnerable to cavalry attacks that avoided their prepared positions and struck with speed that prevented organized resistance. The dismounted men-at-arms who had provided the backbone of English defensive tactics discovered that their advantages disappeared when they were forced to fight as scattered individuals rather than coordinated formations. The march to Reims that followed these military victories represented the political culmination of Joan's mission and the symbolic restoration of legitimate royal authority that the Treaty of Troyes had attempted to eliminate. The ancient cathedral city, where French kings had been crowned since Clovis converted to Christianity, became the focal point for a ceremony that would either validate Joan's claims about divine mission or expose them as peasant delusion and political manipulation. The journey to Reims required French forces to advance through territories that had been under English control for years, testing whether Joan's spiritual authority could inspire the kind of popular uprising that would make English administration impossible to maintain. The response exceeded even optimistic French expectations, as town after town opened its gates to the advancing army without requiring siege operations that would have exhausted French resources and consumed precious time. English garrisons that had maintained control through professional competence and administrative efficiency found themselves isolated and outnumbered, as local populations transferred their allegiance to what they increasingly saw as a legitimate French restoration. The coronation of Charles VII at Reims Cathedral on July 17th was orchestrated as a deliberate reversal of everything that the Treaty of Troyes had represented. Where that agreement had substituted legal technicalities for divine sanction, the coronation ceremony emphasized the sacred nature of royal authority that no earthly treaty could eliminate. Where English rule had been justified through administrative efficiency and military success, French legitimacy was restored through rituals that connected Charles VII to an unbroken chain of Christian kings, stretching back to the conversion of the Frankish kingdom. Joan's role in the coronation ceremony was carefully choreographed to emphasize both her divine mission and her subordination to royal authority that her victories had restored. She stood beside the altar, holding her banner, while the Archbishop of Reims performed the ancient rituals that transformed the Dauphin into the most Christian king of France. But she knelt with the other nobles when the newly crowned king received the homage of his subjects. The message was unmistakable. God had sent Joan to restore legitimate authority, not to replace it with her own. But even as the coronation marked the high point of Joan's public career, it also exposed the limitations of what divine inspiration could accomplish in a world governed by political and military realities. The ceremony at Reims had symbolic importance that far exceeded its immediate practical consequences. But symbols could not resolve the fundamental problems that made French victory uncertain despite recent successes. English forces still controlled the economically vital regions of northern France. English administration still functioned more efficiently than French alternatives, and English military capabilities remained formidable despite tactical setbacks. The attempt to capture Paris that followed the coronation revealed these limitations with painful clarity. The capital city that had been the center of English administration in France was too well defended and too important strategically to be taken by the kind of rapid assault that had captured smaller towns during the march to Reims. English and Burgundian defenders, fighting for positions that they understood to be crucial to their survival, demonstrated that professional soldiers with adequate resources could still resist French attacks regardless of their spiritual inspiration. Joan's wounding during the assault on Paris marked the beginning of her transformation from divinely protected military leader to vulnerable human being whose mortality could not be ignored. The crossbow bolt that struck her thigh was not life-threatening, but it shattered the aura of invincibility that had been essential to her effectiveness as both military commander and spiritual symbol. French soldiers who had followed her with absolute confidence began to question whether divine protection extended to battles that God did not intend them to win. The campaign's failure created political problems that extended far beyond immediate military disappointment. Joan's insistence that her voices had commanded the attack on Paris conflicted with strategic assessments that suggested the assault was premature and ill-planned. The newly crowned king and his advisors, who had accepted Joan's spiritual authority when it coincided with their political objectives, began to assert royal prerogatives that limited her independent action. The result was a gradual erosion of the unity between inspiration and calculation that had made French victories possible. The capture of Joan at Compiègne was not the result of English tactical superiority, but of political miscalculation that exposed her to enemies who understood her value as both military prize and propaganda weapon. The Burgundian soldiers who took her prisoner were fighting as French rebels rather than foreign invaders. But their alliance with England made her transfer to English custody inevitable. The transaction that delivered Joan to English authorities represented one of the most cynical political arrangements of the medieval period, as Burgundian nobles sold their divine prisoner for English gold, while maintaining the fiction that they were simply transferring custody of a heretical rebel. The trial that followed was both legal proceeding and political theatre, designed to accomplish objectives that extended far beyond the fate of a single prisoner. English authorities understood that executing Joan as a common rebel would make her a martyr whose memory could inspire continued resistance. But they also recognized that allowing her to live would provide a permanent symbol around which French opposition could rally. The solution was to destroy her spiritual authority through a heresy trial that would present her execution as divine judgment rather than human vengeance. The theological examination that preceded the trial revealed the sophistication of medieval legal and religious thinking when applied to cases that challenged fundamental assumptions about divine authority and social order. The University of Paris, which provided the theological expertise for the prosecution, approached Joan's claims with intellectual rigor that was designed to expose the logical contradictions and practical impossibilities that her mission represented. If God had truly sent Joan to drive the English from France, why had she been captured? If her voices came from heaven, why had they led her into situations where she could be taken by her enemies? If divine protection covered her mission, why was she now subject to human judgment? Joan's responses to these theological challenges demonstrated both the strength and weakness of conviction that was based on personal revelation rather than institutional authority. Her certainty about her divine mission remained absolute even when confronted with evidence that seemed to contradict her claims. But her inability to provide theological explanations that satisfied academic standards made her vulnerable to charges of heretical presumption. Most damaging was her insistence that she would accept no earthly authority, including that of the church, that contradicted what her voices had told her. The political dimension of the trial was equally important, but more carefully concealed. The English authorities, who orchestrated the proceedings, needed to demonstrate that Joan's military successes had been the result of demonic rather than divine intervention, making English defeats evidence of supernatural evil rather than French virtue. The Burgundian collaborators who participated in the trial needed to justify their alliance with foreign invaders by presenting French resistance as rebellion against legitimate authority. Most importantly, the French clergy who served as judges needed to reconcile their participation in what amounted to judicial murder with their obligations to defend the church against heretical corruption. The execution of Joan of Arc in the marketplace of Rouen was witnessed by thousands of people, whose reactions revealed the complexity of popular attitudes toward divine authority and political legitimacy. English soldiers and administrators who attended, expecting to see the destruction of dangerous enemy, found themselves confronting the burning of a teenager whose courage in facing death seemed to confirm rather than contradict her claims about divine mission. French observers who had hoped for last-minute reprieve or miraculous intervention watched in horror as the flames consumed someone who had become the symbol of their hopes for independence. The immediate aftermath of Joan's death seemed to confirm English calculations about the political benefits of eliminating dangerous inspiration. French military operations lost much of their coordination and intensity as commanders who had relied on Joan's spiritual authority struggled to maintain morale without her presence. The king, who owed his crown to her victories, made no serious attempt to rescue or ransom her, suggesting that royal gratitude had limits when it conflicted with political expediency. Most French nobles seemed relieved to return to more conventional forms of warfare that did not require them to accept the leadership of peasant girls claiming divine authority. But the long-term consequences of Joan's martyrdom proved far more dangerous to English interests than her military leadership had ever been. Her death transformed her from controversial figure, whose authority had been questioned even by supporters, into unambiguous symbol of French resistance that could inspire future generations, without the complications that had surrounded her living presence. The girl who had been captured and executed became the saint who would continue to fight for French independence through the devotion of believers who needed no earthly commander to guide their resistance. The judicial review that eventually declared Joan's trial invalid and her execution unjust served political purposes that were as important as its religious implications. Charles VII's decision to initiate this review reflected not belated gratitude, but calculated policy designed to associate royal authority with popular veneration of Joan's memory. The Church's willingness to reverse its previous judgment demonstrated institutional flexibility that allowed it to align with changing political circumstances while maintaining claims to spiritual infallibility. More significantly, the rehabilitation of Joan's reputation coincided with French military and political developments that were transforming her prophecies into practical reality. The English withdrawal from territories that Joan had helped liberate proved permanent rather than temporary, while French military capabilities continued to improve through institutional reforms that her victories had made possible. The girl who had claimed that God would drive the English from France was being proven correct through human agency that no longer required divine intervention to achieve success. The transformation of Joan from military commander to religious symbol marked a fundamental shift in the nature of French resistance to English occupation. What had begun as feudal rebellion led by dispossessed nobles was becoming popular nationalism that drew its strength from spiritual conviction rather than political calculation. English military supremacy, which had seemed permanent when it was based on tactical innovation and professional competence, proved vulnerable to forms of resistance that transcended traditional military categories. The fire that consumed Joan's body in the marketplace of Rouen had been intended to end the threat that she represented to English rule in France. Instead, it provided the spark that would eventually ignite a popular uprising that no amount of military force could extinguish. The peasant girl who had claimed to hear voices from heaven had become a voice that would speak to French hearts for centuries to come, reminding them that their kingdom belonged to them and that no foreign power could permanently subjugate a people who retained faith in their own destiny. The flames that consumed Joan of Arc in the marketplace of Rouen had been intended to extinguish French resistance, but they instead ignited a transformation that would burn through the foundations of English power in France with inexorable persistence. The martyred maid became more dangerous in death than she had ever been in life, her memory inspiring a form of popular nationalism that no military force could defeat because it lived not in castles or armies, but in the hearts of an entire people who had finally learned what it meant to be French. The years following Joan's execution witnessed the systematic unraveling of everything that English arms had achieved over more than a century of warfare. This was not the sudden collapse that follows military catastrophe, but the slow dissolution that occurs when the political foundations of conquest prove inadequate to sustain the weight of foreign rule. English administrators who had governed French territories with competent efficiency discovered that administrative skill meant nothing when populations had withdrawn their consent to be governed. English soldiers who had maintained order through professional discipline found themselves fighting an invisible enemy that could not be defeated because it existed wherever French hearts beat, with resentment against foreign occupation. The Congress of Arras represented the diplomatic revolution that made French victory inevitable by destroying the alliance system that had sustained English power since the Treaty of Troy. Philip the Good, Duke of Burgundy, had finally concluded that Burgundian interests required reconciliation with French royal authority rather than continued alliance with increasingly desperate English regents. The Duke's territories in the Low Countries and eastern France were prosperous enough to function independently, but they could not indefinitely resist French pressure while depending on English support that was becoming less reliable with each passing year. The negotiations at Arras revealed how completely the strategic balance had shifted since Henry V's triumphant campaigns. English negotiators, led by the Duke of Bedford, found themselves in the position of supplicants rather than conquerors, offering concessions that would have been unthinkable during the previous phase of the war. The English were willing to abandon most of their territorial claims in France, to accept Charles VII's legitimacy as King of France, and to return to something resembling the feudal relationship that had existed before Edward III's assertion of royal claims. But even these dramatic concessions could not overcome the fundamental reality that English power in France was collapsing, and that French confidence was growing with each passing month. The Duke of Burgundy's reconciliation with Charles VII was accomplished through a ceremony that deliberately reversed the political relationships established by decades of civil war and foreign intervention. Philip knelt before Charles in acknowledgement of royal authority, but this submission was balanced by royal recognition of Burgundian autonomy that preserved the Duke's practical independence while restoring the theoretical unity of the French kingdom. More importantly, the agreement included specific provisions for military cooperation against English forces that remained in French territory, transforming Burgundy from England's most valuable ally into their most dangerous enemy. The immediate military consequences of the Burgundian reconciliation were devastating for English strategic position throughout northern France. English garrisons that had depended on Burgundian support for supplies and reinforcements found themselves isolated and vulnerable to coordinated attacks by French and Burgundian forces, fighting in alliance for the first time in decades. The elaborate network of fortifications and administrative centres that had sustained English rule began to crumble as defenders discovered that their positions were no longer tenable without external support. But the deeper significance of Arras lay in its demonstration that French national identity had evolved beyond the feudal loyalties that had made civil war possible. The Burgundian reconciliation was not simply a diplomatic arrangement between competing noble houses, but the recognition that regional autonomy and royal authority could coexist within a framework that prioritized French independence over factional advantage. The kingdom that emerged from this reconciliation was not the same France that had collapsed during the early phases of the war, but something new that combined centralized effectiveness with popular legitimacy. Charles VII's military reforms, implemented during the years following Joan's death, created the institutional foundations for this new form of French power. The royal ordinances that established permanent taxation and standing armies represented a fundamental transformation in the relationship between crown and nobility that would serve as a model for state development throughout Europe. French nobles, who had traditionally provided military service in exchange for feudal privileges, found themselves contributing to royal revenues that supported professional forces more effective than any feudal levy. The military innovations that emerged from these reforms reflected lessons learned through decades of defeat and adaptation. French artillery, developed by engineers who understood the latest advances in gunpowder technology, proved capable of reducing English fortifications that had previously seemed impregnable. French cavalry, reorganized according to tactical principles that emphasized coordinated charges rather than individual prowess, could overwhelm English positions that longbowmen could no longer adequately defend. Most importantly, French armies had learned to fight as disciplined professional forces rather than collections of individual warriors seeking personal glory. The systematic French reconquest of Normandy proceeded with methodical efficiency that demonstrated the maturation of French military capabilities. Rather than attempting to recapture major strongholds through expensive siege operations, French commanders focused on isolating English positions by controlling the countryside around them. English garrisons that had maintained control of strategic points for decades suddenly found themselves cut off from supplies and reinforcements, as French forces made the roads too dangerous for English convoys to traverse. The fall of Rouen, the capital of English administration in Normandy, symbolized the completion of this process and the effective end of English power in northern France. The city that had witnessed Joan's execution was recaptured through siege operations that demonstrated how completely military technology had evolved since the early phases of the war. French cannons, firing stone balls with unprecedented accuracy and power, breached walls that had been strengthened against traditional siege engines, but could not withstand the new artillery that was transforming warfare throughout Europe. The English evacuation of Normandy was conducted with professional competence that reflected the military traditions of a century of continental warfare, but it could not disguise the magnitude of the strategic disaster that was unfolding. Territories that had been English for decades were abandoned to French administration, while populations that had accepted English rule discovered that their new allegiance would be tested by French officials who remembered every collaboration with the former occupiers. The administrative records that English bureaucrats had maintained with meticulous care were either destroyed or transferred to French authorities, who would use them to identify those who had served foreign interests too enthusiastically. Meanwhile, in England itself, the political strains created by military failure in France were contributing to domestic instability that would eventually explode into the civil wars known to history as the Wars of the Roses. The Lancastrian dynasty that had achieved such spectacular success under Henry V found its legitimacy questioned as military defeats mounted, and the costs of defending remaining French territories strained royal finances beyond their capacity to bear. English nobles who had invested their wealth and prestige in continental campaigns watched their investments disappear as French forces recaptured territories that had seemed permanently secure. The minority of Henry VI created additional complications that made effective response to French successes almost impossible. The king, who had inherited 2 crowns as an infant, remained mentally and politically immature, even as he reached physical adulthood, displaying signs of the same mental instability that had afflicted his grandfather, Charles VI of France. English government was effectively controlled by competing factions of nobles and administrators whose disagreements about policy were exacerbated by uncertainty about royal authority and dynastic legitimacy. The bravery that erupted in France during this period tested whether Charles VII's institutional reforms could survive the kind of noble rebellion that had previously paralyzed French resistance to English occupation. The conspiracy involved some of the greatest names in French nobility, including the future Louis XI, and represented a final attempt by traditional feudal forces to prevent the transformation of France into a centralized monarchy. But the rebellion's failure demonstrated that French society had evolved beyond the point where noble faction could challenge royal authority, backed by popular support and professional military force. The systematic elimination of English strongholds throughout central and southwestern France proceeded with mechanical precision that reflected the efficiency of the new French military organization. Castles that had controlled strategic routes for generations were reduced by artillery bombardments that made traditional fortification obsolete. Administrative centers that had governed English territories with bureaucratic competence were captured by French forces that understood both siege warfare and political administration. Most importantly, the populations that had accepted English rule began to transfer their allegiance to French authorities, who could provide both effective government and cultural legitimacy. The financial implications of these military disasters created political crises in England that revealed how completely the kingdom's strategic position had deteriorated. The taxation necessary to maintain garrisons in remaining French territories was generating domestic resentment that threatened to explode into rebellion, while the inability to protect English interests in France was undermining the royal prestige that had sustained Lancastrian authority since Henry IV's usurpation. English merchants who had profited from access to continental markets watched their trade routes disappear as French control of coastal regions made commercial relations increasingly difficult. The fall of Bordeaux, capital of the English Duchy of Gascony, marked the effective end of the English continental empire that had survived in various forms since the Norman conquest. The city that had been English for 3 centuries surrendered to French forces after a siege that demonstrated both the inevitability of French victory and the obsolescence of English tactical methods. The wine trade that had connected Gascony to England for generations was disrupted by political changes that transformed commercial relationships into diplomatic negotiations between sovereign powers. John Talbot, Earl of Shrewsbury, represented everything magnificent and obsolete about the English military tradition that was dying with the loss of France. At more than 60 years of age, Talbot had fought in every major campaign of the war's later phases, earning a reputation for courage and tactical competence that made him a legendary figure among English soldiers. His decision to lead a final expedition to recapture Bordeaux was both strategically hopeless and personally inevitable. The gesture of a warrior whose identity was inseparable from the continental empire that his lifetime of service had failed to preserve. The Battle of Castillon unfolded like an epitaph for medieval warfare, with all the grandeur and futility that characterized the end of an era. Talbot's army, representing the finest traditions of English military organization, attacked French positions that embodied everything revolutionary about the new style of warfare that was emerging throughout Europe. French artillery, positioned behind field fortifications that had been designed specifically to counter traditional English tactics, created killing zones that made cavalry charges suicidal and infantry assaults hopeless. Talbot's death in the mud of Castillon was more than the loss of an individual commander. It was the symbolic end of the chivalric ideal that had sustained English military culture for centuries. The Earl who fell beneath French cannon fire had embodied the personal courage and tactical skill that had once made English armies invincible. But individual prowess meant nothing against the systematic application of superior technology and coordinated firepower. The age of the knight hero was ending, replaced by an era of professional soldiers, serving institutional rather than personal loyalties. The English withdrawal from France was completed without formal treaty or ceremonial acknowledgement, a quiet ending to a conflict that had begun with such grandiose claims and spectacular ambitions. The last English soldiers departed from Calais, which remained under English control as a final remnant of continental empire, while French administration was established throughout territories that had been English for generations. The bureaucratic efficiency that had characterized English rule was replaced by French institutions that served similar functions while drawing their legitimacy from different sources. The transformation was not merely political, but cultural, as populations that had lived under English rule for decades, or even centuries, rediscovered their French identity through administrative changes that touched every aspect of daily life. English law was replaced by French custom, English officials were succeeded by French administrators, and English commercial privileges were transferred to French merchants who could provide the same services while maintaining loyalty to French royal authority. The institutional memory of English rule was systematically erased through administrative procedures that left little trace of the foreign occupation that had once seemed permanent. The war that had consumed 5 generations and transformed the nature of European civilization ended not with triumphant victory celebrations or formal peace negotiations, but with the quiet exhaustion of a conflict that had outlived its original purposes and participants. The 100 Years' War, which had lasted not 100 but 116 years, concluded with a whimper rather than a bang, its end marked more by the absence of fighting than by any decisive resolution of the issues that had originally caused it. The Europe that emerged from this prolonged catastrophe was fundamentally different from the medieval world that had entered it. The feudal relationships that had structured society for centuries had been replaced by new forms of political organization that emphasized institutional loyalty over personal bonds. The chivalric ideals that had governed warfare had been superseded by professional military techniques that prioritized efficiency over honor. Most importantly, the fragmented political landscape of medieval Europe was giving way to centralized nation-states that could mobilize entire populations for sustained conflict. France, the kingdom that had suffered most severely during the war's early phases, emerged as the dominant power in Western Europe, with institutional capabilities that exceeded anything medieval governments had previously achieved. The military reforms initiated by Charles VII had created a standing army that could maintain order throughout the kingdom while projecting power beyond French borders. The taxation system that supported this military establishment had generated revenues that allowed French kings to undertake ambitious projects without depending on noble cooperation or foreign loans. Most significantly, the sense of French national identity that had emerged during the struggle against English occupation had created popular loyalty to royal authority that transcended regional differences and class divisions. England, by contrast, found itself forced to confront the implications of military failure and imperial contraction in ways that would reshape English political development for centuries to come. The loss of continental territories that had been English for generations required fundamental reconsideration of what England was and what role it should play in European politics. The financial costs of defending French possessions had strained English resources beyond their capacity, while the political costs of military failure had undermined royal authority in ways that would contribute to domestic civil war. The Wars of the Roses that erupted in England during the final phases of the French conflict represented more than simply dynastic competition between rival claimants to the throne. They reflected deeper tensions about the nature of English royal authority and the relationship between continental ambitions and domestic governance that the 100 Years' War had created but not resolved. The England that eventually emerged from these civil wars would be more insular and more focused on domestic development, but it would also be more unified and more capable of sustained effort when national consensus supported royal policy. The military innovations that had emerged during the conflict transformed warfare throughout Europe in ways that made medieval tactical methods obsolete. The longbow that had dominated battlefields for more than a century was being superseded by firearms that required less training while providing greater effectiveness against armored opponents. The heavy cavalry that had been the foundation of medieval military organization was giving way to combined arms formations that integrated infantry, artillery, and mounted forces in coordinated tactical systems. Most importantly, the professional armies that had proven so effective during the war's later phases were becoming permanent features of European political organization, rather than temporary expedients for specific campaigns. The economic consequences of prolonged warfare had accelerated changes that were already transforming European commercial relationships and urban development. The Italian banking houses that had financed royal ambitions throughout the conflict had accumulated unprecedented wealth and political influence that made them crucial factors in international diplomacy. The Flemish cloth industry that had been disrupted by English embargo and French invasion had adapted to new markets and production techniques that reduced dependence on traditional suppliers. Most significantly, the fiscal innovations that both kingdoms had developed to finance military operations had created new forms of state power that could generate resources on scales that medieval governments had never imagined possible. The religious implications of the conflict's conclusion were equally profound, as the Catholic Church struggled to reassert spiritual authority that had been compromised by political involvement in national conflicts. The Great Schism that had divided papal authority during much of the war's duration had been resolved through conciliar action that established precedents for limiting papal power while strengthening institutional governance. The emergence of national churches that served royal policy while maintaining doctrinal orthodoxy had created new relationships between secular and religious authority that would influence European development for centuries. Joan of Arc's canonization, which occurred centuries after her death, represented the ultimate triumph of popular devotion over institutional authority in ways that reflected the broader transformation of European religious culture. The peasant girl who had been executed as a heretic became a saint whose cult transcended national boundaries while serving French political interests. Her transformation from controversial figure to religious symbol demonstrated how individual inspiration could shape collective memory in ways that outlasted the political circumstances that had originally given it meaning. The technological innovations that had emerged during the conflict extended far beyond military applications to influence every aspect of European economic and social development. The artillery that had made medieval fortifications obsolete required new forms of metallurgy and engineering that contributed to broader industrial development. The logistics systems that had sustained armies throughout extended campaigns had created transportation networks that facilitated commercial expansion and cultural exchange. Most importantly, the communication systems that had been developed for military coordination had improved information flow in ways that accelerated intellectual and artistic development throughout Europe. The cultural legacy of the Hundred Years' War was equally transformative, as the conflict had provided material for literary and artistic works that would shape European imagination for centuries to come. The chronicles that recorded the war's events established narrative traditions that influenced historical writing throughout the medieval and early modern periods. The chivalric romances that romanticized military exploits created literary models that affected aristocratic behavior and popular culture. Most significantly, the national literatures that emerged during the conflict had established vernacular traditions that displaced Latin as the primary medium for serious intellectual and artistic expression. The diplomatic innovations that had been developed during the conflict established precedents for international relations that would influence European politics far beyond the medieval period. The complex alliance systems that had connected French and English interests to broader European conflicts had created models for multinational cooperation and competition that anticipated later balance of power arrangements. The peace negotiations that had attempted to resolve specific disputes had established procedural precedents for international arbitration and conflict resolution. Most importantly, the concept of sovereignty that had emerged during disputes over royal authority had provided conceptual foundations for the modern state system. The social transformations that had resulted from prolonged warfare had accelerated changes that were already reshaping European class relationships and cultural values. The military prominence of non-noble professionals had challenged traditional assumptions about social hierarchy, while creating new forms of advancement based on merit rather than birth. The economic opportunities that warfare had created for merchants, craftsmen, and administrators had generated new forms of wealth that could compete with traditional landed fortunes. Most significantly, the popular participation in national resistance that had characterized the war's later phases had established precedents for political involvement that transcended traditional feudal relationships. As the survivors of this great conflict settled into the routines of peace, they could hardly have imagined the world that their struggles had created. The medieval Europe of fragmented authority and personal loyalty was giving way to early modern states capable of sustained effort and systematic administration. The chivalric culture that had celebrated individual prowess and personal honor was being superseded by professional competence and institutional effectiveness. The religious unity that had provided spiritual foundations for medieval civilization was evolving into denominational diversity that would eventually reshape the relationship between faith and politics throughout the Western world. The England and France that emerged from the Hundred Years' War would continue to compete for European dominance, but their future conflicts would be fought with different weapons, different tactics, and different objectives than the medieval warfare that had consumed their ancestors. The institutional innovations, technological developments, and cultural transformations that had emerged during the prolonged struggle had created foundations for early modern civilization that would influence European development far beyond the immediate participants in the original conflict. The war that had begun with feudal disputes over royal succession had ended with the birth of the modern European state system. The kingdoms that had fought for medieval concepts of honor and legitimacy had been transformed into nations capable of mobilizing entire populations for sustained effort toward collective objectives. The Europe that awakened from this century-long nightmare had been forever changed by the experience, carrying scars that would influence its development for generations, while possessing capabilities that would eventually reshape the entire world. In the quiet that followed the gun's silence, in the peace that settled over lands that had known only warfare for generations, the survivors could finally rest. But their rest came in a world that had been transformed beyond recognition, where the old certainties had been replaced by new possibilities, and ancient limitations had been overcome by institutional innovations that would echo through the centuries. The medieval world was ending, and the modern world was beginning, born from the ashes of the 100 Years' War.